They will tell you he was the greatest king who ever lived. They will sing of his conquests, his iron will, the way entire kingdoms drop to their knees at the sound of his name. But nobody tells you what happens when a man who conquered the world turns around and finds the one person who loved him bleeding out on a cold stone floor. This is not a love story. This is a war story. And the war was never on the battlefield. Stay with me until the very end of this one. Hit that like, drop your city in the comments, and let me know where you are watching from, because this story is going to wreck you. The thunder came first. It always did before Vaelor Draven entered a room. Not real thunder, not the kind that split the sky over the Greymarch Mountains, but something worse. The silence of every man, woman, and servant pulling their breath inward, holding it like a secret they were afraid to spill. That silence had its own sound, and it rolled through the grand hall of Verelion like a pressure wave, bending candle flames and stiffening spines. He walked through the central corridor with the weight of 40,000 dead men sewn into the hem of his cloak. Black fur over blackened steel. His boots left no echo because the stone had learned not to talk back. 12 years of conquest had carved the softness out of his face, the way a river carves a canyon, slowly, then all at once, until what remained was not handsome or ugly, but simply hard. A jaw like the edge of an axe, eyes the color of a winter lake just before it freezes solid, a scar that began at his left temple and disappeared into his hairline, a gift from the siege of Carvos, where he had held the gate alone for 9 minutes while his lieutenant bled to death in the mud behind him. Vaelor Draven did not sit on the throne. He dropped into it. The way a man drops a weapon after the killing is done. His fingers curled over the armrests, and the gold filigree bit into his calluses, and he did not flinch because flinching was a language he had forgotten how to speak. General Torvan stood 6 paces to the left, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the king the way a man watches a fire that has grown too large for the hearth. "How many?" Vaelor said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Torvain swallowed. 1,400, my king. The northern villages along the Ashenmere border. They burned what they could not carry. Salted what they could not burn. Vaelor stared straight ahead. The grand hall stretched before him like the throat of some ancient beast, pillars rising into shadow, banners hanging limp in the windless air. Gold everywhere. Gold in the thread, gold in the fixtures, gold melted into the grout between the stones because Vaelor had ordered it years ago during a fever of ambition that now felt like someone else's dream. And the garrison commander? Dead, Torvain said. They found him in a ditch with his own belt around his neck. The rebels left a message carved into his chest. What did it say? Torvain hesitated. 1 heartbeat. 2. Vaelor's eyes moved to him, and the temperature in the room dropped by something you could not measure but everyone could feel. It said the crown bleeds next, Torvain said. Vaelor exhaled through his nose, a slow, measured thing, like a man releasing steam from a sealed chamber. He turned his gaze back to the empty hall, and something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, not anger, but the cold arithmetic of a man calculating how many bodies it would take to fill a ditch. Double the Eastern Regiment. Pull Marin's cavalry from the Thornwall garrison and station them along the river. And Torvain? Yes, my king. Find me the name of the man who carved that message. I want him alive. I want him to watch his village disappear from the face of the earth before I let him close his eyes. Torvain bowed and left. His footsteps faded down the corridor, and Vaelor was alone with the gold and the silence and the faint smell of smoke that never quite left his skin anymore. He sat there for a long time. The candles burned lower, shadows climbed the walls like ivy. And somewhere deep in the palace, 3 floors above and 2 corridors east, a woman pressed her hand against the swell of her belly and stared out a window at a sky that offered her nothing. Seraphina Valhart had not always been afraid of windows. There was a time, before the crown, before the palace, before the gold that covered everything like a disease, when she had stood at the open window of her father's estate and let the wind from the Alcaran Valley tangle her hair into knots she did not bother to fix. She had been 17 then, reckless with her laughter, stupid with her hope. She had believed that the world was a place where good things happened to people who waited for them, and she had waited, and what arrived was Vaelor Draven. He had come to her father's estate on horseback, alone, which was itself a kind of violence because kings did not travel alone. Kings traveled with retinues and banners, and the constant noise of people trying to be noticed. But Valor had come with nothing but his horse and his scar, and the quiet certainty that everything he looked at already belonged to him. She had watched him from the same posture, hand on the windowsill, body angled like a question mark, and she had thought, there, that one. That is the one who will either save me or destroy me, and I do not care which. She cared now. The baby moved, a small, insistent pressure against her ribs, like a fist knocking on a door. She pressed back gently, the way you press back against something you love but cannot see. Not yet, she whispered. Not yet, little one. The world is not ready for you. And honestly, your father is not either. A knock at the door, real this time, not the phantom kind that lived in her belly. My queen. The voice belonged to Lyriel, her handmaiden, a thin, sharp-boned woman with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that said almost everything. The king has requested your presence at this evening's reception. Seraphina did not turn from the window. Requested, she said. That is a new word for it. Lyriel paused. She has learned over 3 years of service to read the spaces between Seraphina's words the way a sailor reads the spaces between waves. Shall I tell him you are unwell, my queen? Seraphina closed her eyes. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she felt something shift in her chest that was not physical, but might as well have been. A tightening. A small collapse in some internal architecture that she had been rebuilding every morning since Valor stopped visiting her chambers. No, she said. She opened her eyes. Tell him I will be there. Tell him his queen will stand beside him and smile and do all the things that queens are supposed to do while their husbands parade other women through the hall like livestock at auction. Lyriel's face did not change, but her hands tightened at her sides. The noblewoman will be in attendance then. Seraphina's mouth bent into something that was not a smile. Lady Thessara Morvain. Yes. She will be there because she is always there, Lyriel. She is there like the gold is there. Decorative, permanent, and far more valuable to the crown than a pregnant wife who asks too many questions. Lyriel stepped forward. My queen, I do not think the king means to— Do not! Seraphina's voice cracked like a branch underfoot. Do not stand there and tell me what the king means. I have spent 3 years trying to decode what the king means, and I have concluded that the king means exactly what the king does, and what the king does is whatever serves the empire. I am carrying his child, Lyriel, his heir. And I found out from a servant that Thessara Morvain has been given chambers in the East Wing, where the royal consorts have stayed for 6 generations. So please do not tell me what the king means. I have eyes, I have a mind, and I have a memory that works perfectly well, even if everyone in this palace pretends otherwise. Lyriel said nothing. There was nothing to say. She bowed her head and left to prepare the queen's gown, and Seraphina stood at the window and pressed her hand against her belly and breathed in the way women breathe when they are trying not to shatter. The reception that evening was a spectacle designed to remind every lord and lady in attendance that Verelion was not simply a kingdom, but a force of nature with a tax code. The grand hall had been transformed. Long tables draped in black silk ran the length of the room, laden with roasted game and winter fruit and bottles of Ashenvale wine that cost more per glass than a farmer earned in a season. Musicians played from a raised platform in the corner, their instruments producing a sound that was technically beautiful but felt, to Seraphina, like someone humming while a house burned down. She descended the eastern staircase in a gown of deep emerald, the fabric cut to accommodate her belly without hiding it, because hiding was a luxury she could no longer afford. Every eye in the hall tracked her movement, and she felt each gaze like a fingertip pressed against exposed skin. Some were curious, some were pitying, some were hungry in ways that had nothing to do with the feast. Valor stood at the head table, and for one dislocated moment she saw him the way she had seen him that first day at her father's estate. Tall, immovable, beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. He wore black, always black, and the crown sat on his head like it had grown there. His jaw was set. His posture was the posture of a man who expected the world to arrange itself around him, and the world, obedient as ever, had complied. Then she saw Thessara. Lady Thessara Morvain stood 3 paces to Valor's right, and 3 paces was close enough to share warmth, but far enough to maintain the fiction that nothing was happening. She was tall, willowy, with hair the color of a dark copper, and a face that belonged on a coin. Her gown was midnight blue, cut low enough to make a statement and high enough to deny making one. She was laughing at something Valor had said, and the sound of her laughter was like glass breaking in slow motion, each piece catching the light as it fell. Seraphina's hand found her belly. The baby was still. "My queen." Lord Aldrich Voss materialized at her elbow, a thin man with a thin smile and the kind of political intelligence that flourished in the spaces between power and fear. "You look radiant this evening. You look like you want something, Aldrich." His smile widened. "I always want something, my queen. That is what makes me useful. Tonight, however, I want only to offer my arm and my company, both of which are considerably less dangerous than they appear." She took his arm because refusing would have created a scene, and scenes were the currency of the court, traded and hoarded and spent at the worst possible moments. They walked together toward the head table, and as they approached, Violor's eyes found Seraphina's across the noise and the candlelight and the golden everything, and for one fraction of a second, something moved in his face. Not guilt. Valor Draven did not do guilt, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood and occasionally borrowed its clothes. Then the moment passed. He turned back to Thessara, leaned in to hear something she was saying, and Seraphina felt the last thread of something inside her pull taut and begin to fray. She took her seat at the table. Aldrich sat beside her, murmuring pleasantries she did not hear. The food was placed before her, and she did not eat. The wine was poured, and she did not drink. She watched. She watched Violor lean toward Thessara, the way a compass needle leans toward north, involuntary, inevitable. She watched the way his hand rested on the table between them, palm up, open, a gesture so small and so intimate that it was worse than a kiss, because a kiss is a declaration and an open palm is a confession. She watched Thessara mirror his posture, her body angling toward his like a plant toward light, and she felt the room shrink until there was nothing in it but the three of them and the unbearable mathematics of desire. Lord Aldrich leaned close. "The court is watching, my queen. They are watching you watch him. Let them." Aldrich's smile did not waver, but his voice dropped. "They will not simply watch, my queen. They will interpret. An interpretation in this court is a weapon wielded by people who have already chosen their target." Seraphina turned to him. Her eyes were dry. She had used up her tears months ago, spent them on pillows and in bath water, and in the small hours of the morning when the palace was quiet enough to hear her own heartbreak. "Then let them interpret this," she said, and she stood. The hall went quiet, not the enforced silence of the king's arrival, but the organic hush that falls when something unexpected is about to happen, and everyone in the room can taste it on the air, like iron before rain. Seraphina walked the length of the table. Every step was deliberate, measured, the walk of a woman who had practiced composure until it became a second skeleton. She passed lords who looked away. She passed ladies who looked directly at her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to satisfaction. She passed servants who pretended to be invisible and guards who pretended to be furniture. She stopped in front of Valor. He looked up at her. The crown caught the candlelight, and for a moment the gold seemed to glow from within, like something alive, something that fed on the attention of everyone in the room. "My king," she said. Her voice carried. She had learned that from him. "You have not asked me to dance." The silence tightened. The Tsar's expression did not change, but her fingers curled slightly around the stem of her wine glass, and that small movement was the loudest thing in the room. Violor studied his wife. His eyes moved over her face the way a general surveys terrain before committing troops. "You should not be on your feet," he said. The physicians have said that I am carrying your air, not that I have become furniture." She held his gaze. "Dance with me. Or do I need an appointment for that as well?" Something flickered in his jaw. A muscle. A decision. He stood slowly with the kind of deliberate authority that turned even the act of rising from a chair into a statement of dominance. He offered his hand. She took it. They moved to the floor, and the musicians shifted their tempo with the instinct of people whose livelihood depended on reading the mood of the room with absolute precision. A slower melody, strings predominantly. Something that ached. He held her the way he held everything, firmly, with control, his hand on the small of her back, his other hand engulfing hers, and she could feel the calluses, the rough geography of a man who still swung a sword when he could have ordered others to swing it for him. They danced in silence for 8 beats. 12. 16. You have been avoiding me, she said. I have been running an empire. Those are the same thing now? His jaw tightened. Serafina, do you remember what you said to me on our wedding night? She looked up at him. She had to tilt her head because he was a full head taller, and the crown added another 2 inches of borrowed divinity. You said that the crown would never come between us. You said you married me because I was the only person in the world who made you feel like a man instead of a king. Do you remember that? He said nothing. His hand pressed harder against her back, and she did not know if he was pulling her closer or bracing himself against something. Because I remember, she said. I remember every word. I wrote them down. I kept them like a contract, Valor, like a promise carved into stone, and now I watch you break that promise every night from a window in a room you have not entered in 2 months, and I'm carrying your child. Your child. And the whole court knows that the Sara Morvain sleeps in the East Wing, and the whole court knows what the East Wing means, and the whole court watches me pretend that I do not know. And I am tired. I am so tired of pretending. Her voice had not risen. It had done the opposite. It had gone low and flat and quiet, the way water goes quiet just before it finds the crack in the dam. Valor stopped dancing. They stood in the center of the floor, his hand still on her back, and every person in the grand hall was watching with the kind of fascination that humans reserve for moments of beautiful destruction. Not here, he said. Then where? Where is the place in this palace where I am allowed to be your wife instead of your decoration? Because I have looked, Valor. I have looked in every room and every hallway and every cold bed in this golden prison, and I cannot find it. His eyes changed. Something shifted behind the ice, deep down where the real Valor lived, the one she had married, the one who had once held her face in both hands and told her that the world could burn as long as she was standing in it. She saw him, for just a moment, struggling beneath the surface of the king like a man trapped under frozen water. Then the ice closed over. We will discuss this in private, he said. His voice was the voice of the throne, not loud, not cruel, but final in a way that left no room for anything human. He released her. He stepped back. He turned and walked to the table where the Sara Morvain sat with her copper hair and her midnight gown and her perfect political silence, and he sat down beside her, and Serafina stood alone on the dance floor with her hand on her belly and the weight of an empire pressing down on the space where her heart used to be. Lyril found her in the corridor afterward. Serafina was leaning against the wall, one hand braced against the cold stone, the other wrapped around her middle. She was not crying. She had moved past crying into some territory beyond it, some dry and barren country where tears were beside the point. My queen, I need air. The gardens are... I need air that does not belong to this palace, Lirael. I need air that has not been breathed by liars and cowards and women who smile while they steal. But since that air does not exist inside these walls, the gardens will have to do. They walked together through the East Passage, past the portrait gallery, where 6 generations of Draven kings stared down from oil and canvas with the same cold certainty that their bloodline was the most important thing the world had ever produced. Serafina did not look at them. She had memorized their faces years ago and found nothing in them worth remembering. The garden was dark and cold and smelled of wet stone and dying jasmine. She sat on a bench beneath a magnolia tree that had been planted the year Valor took the throne. And she looked up at the sky and counted the stars, because counting was something her mind could do while the rest of her fell apart. Lirael stood nearby, watching, waiting, the way she always did. He is not a bad man, Serafina said finally. That is the worst part, Lirael. A bad man I could hate. A bad man I could leave. But Valor is not bad. He is broken. He was broken before I ever met him, and I thought I could fix him because I was young and I was arrogant, and I believed that love was a kind of medicine. But love is not medicine. Love is a wound that you give someone permission to make, and Valor does not even realize he is cutting me. She paused. The baby moved again, a slow rolling motion like a tide. The Sara is not the problem, she continued. The Sara is a symptom. The problem is that Valor learned a long time ago that people are tools. His father taught him that. His generals taught him that. Every battle and every negotiation and every calculated betrayal taught him that people are instruments to be used and maintained and, when necessary, replaced. and now he is applying that lesson to me. Not because he is cruel, but because cruelty and strategy look exactly the same when you have forgotten how to tell the difference. L'Oreal sat down beside her. She did not speak. She simply sat there, and the silence between them was the silence of two women who understood that the world was not built for them, but who continued to inhabit it anyway, out of stubbornness or hope, or the simple animal refusal to stop breathing. 3 weeks passed. The rebellion in the north grew like a vine, sending tendrils along the border, choking supply lines and burning granaries. Vailor spent his days in the war room, a cavernous space beneath the East Tower filled with maps and models and the stale air of men who had not slept enough and had drunk too much. His nights were divided between strategy sessions with his generals and meetings with the noble houses whose loyalty was an expensive and perishable commodity. Serafina saw him twice during those 3 weeks. Once in a corridor, passing each other like ships whose captains had forgotten they were in the same fleet. He had nodded, she had nodded back. They had continued walking in opposite directions, and the distance between them had grown by exactly the length of a hallway and approximately the width of an ocean. The second time was worse. She had gone to his study. She had stood outside the door for 4 minutes, which she knew because she counted her own heartbeats, and there were 240 of them, which meant her heart was beating at 60 beats per minute, which was calm, which was a lie. She knocked. Enter. She entered. He was standing behind his desk, bent over a map, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his forearms marked with ink and the faint white lines of old scars. He looked up and something crossed his face, fast and involuntary, like a bird flying across the sun. Serafina. "The baby will come in 6 weeks," she said. "The physicians say sooner, maybe." She stood in the doorway because entering his space uninvited felt like trespassing, which was insane because she was his wife, and this was supposed to be her home, and yet here she was, standing at the threshold of her husband's study like a petitioner at the gate. "I know," he said. "Do you? Because you have not asked. You have not asked about the child. You have not asked about my health. You have not asked about anything that does not have a tactical value since the night I embarrassed you at the reception. And I did not come here to fight, Vailor. I came here to tell you that your child is alive and growing and will arrive soon, and I thought maybe that information might matter to you. Even a little." He straightened. He was quiet for a long time, and in that silence she could hear the war. Not the actual sound of it, but the weight of it pressing down on him, bending his spine, aging him by increments that only someone who loved him would notice. "Everything matters to me," he said, "but not everything can matter equally. Not right now. The northern border is collapsing. The Ashenmere Alliance is fracturing. I have 17,000 soldiers deployed across 4 fronts and a treasury that is hemorrhaging gold because maintaining an empire costs more than building one. So yes, the child matters. You matter. But if I do not hold this empire together, there will be nothing left to give either of you." She stared at him. He looked back. And between them, in the space where a marriage was supposed to live, there was nothing but maps and mathematics and the cold pragmatism of a man who had replaced his heart with a balance sheet. "Choose," she said. "What? Choose." "Right now. This empire or this family? Because you cannot have both, Vailor. You have been trying to have both for 3 years, and all you have done is starve both of them. So choose. Look at me and tell me which one matters more." He did not answer immediately. She wanted him to. She wanted him to say it fast, without thinking, the way you say the name of the person you love when someone wakes you from a dead sleep. She wanted it to be instinct. She wanted it to be her. "The Empire," he said. And then, quieter, as if the words cost him something he could not afford. "The Empire has to come first, Serafina, because without the Empire, we are nothing. We are 2 people in a field somewhere, waiting for someone stronger to come and take everything from us. I did not build this so that our children could inherit weakness. I built this so they would never have to be afraid." She felt it happen. The last thread. The one she had been feeling fray since the night of the reception. The one that connected her to the version of Vailor she had married. It did not snap. It simply dissolved, quietly, like salt in water, and what remained was clear and tasteless and offered no nourishment whatsoever. "Your children," she said. She put her hand on her belly. "This child. This one, right here. This is not an abstraction, Vailor. This is not a line on a succession chart. This is a person. a person I have been building inside my body while you build your empire. And the difference between us is that I would burn the empire to the ground to keep this child safe, and you would sacrifice this child to keep the empire standing. That is not... It is. It is exactly that. And the fact that you cannot see it is the reason I am standing here alone. She left. He did not follow. The maps lay on the desk between them like an ocean they had both decided was too wide to cross. Veilor stood in the empty room for a long time after she left. The candle on his desk burned down to a stub. Wax pooled on the wood, hardened, became a small monument to lost time. He pressed both palms flat against the map, leaning forward until his arms shook, and he closed his eyes and breathed and tried to remember what it had felt like before the crown, before the conquests, before the empire became the only language he knew how to speak. He could not remember. The man he had been before Verelion was a stranger, someone who had existed briefly and dimly, like a candle in a room with too many windows. The draft had gotten to him early. Torvald found him there an hour later. My king, the northern front. We have lost the Ashen Mere crossing. Veilor opened his eyes. The ice was back. The armor was back. The king was back, standing in the place where the man had been, and the man retreated to whatever dark corner of Veilor's interior he had been living in for years, quiet, patient, slowly starving. "Rally the reserves," Veilor said. "I ride at dawn." And the war swallowed him whole. Serafina watched from her window as the army departed, a column of steel and horse and dust moving northward through the valley like a river flowing uphill. She counted the banners. She looked for his, the black standard with the silver crown, and she found it at the front of the column, because of course it was at the front, because Veilor Draven did not lead from behind. He led from the place where the swords were sharpest and the dying was closest, and she hated him for it and loved him for it in equal measure, and the contradiction sat in her chest like a stone she could neither swallow nor spit out. The palace changed the moment the king left. The walls did not move, but they seemed to lean inward. The hallways grew longer. The servants grew quieter. And the court, that elegant machine of ambition and betrayal, began to recalibrate itself around the absence of the only thing that had kept it in check. Lord Aldrich Voss arrived at her chamber door on the third morning. "My queen, I bring unfortunate news. The council has convened in the king's absence and has appointed Lord Marin Duskwood as acting regent until the king's return." Serafina turned from the window. Marin Duskwood, the man who told me to my face that a pregnant queen is a liability to the throne. Aldrich tilted his head. "Politics is not a game for people with accurate memories, my queen. It tends to be more comfortable for those who can forget selectively." "What does this mean for me?" "It means that the council now controls the palace guard, the treasury, and the flow of information in and out of these walls. It means that your authority, which was already decorative, has been effectively suspended. And it means, my queen, that you are now surrounded by people who do not answer to you, do not fear you, and in several notable cases, actively wish you harm." She stared at him. The baby kicked, hard, a sharp, urgent pressure, as if even the child could feel the walls closing in. "Why are you telling me this, Aldrich?" "Because someone should, and because I have invested considerable effort in keeping you alive, and I would hate to see that investment wasted." He bowed and left. Serafina stood in her chamber with her hand on her belly, and the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears, and the cold, absolute knowledge that she was alone in a palace full of wolves, and the only person who could have protected her had chosen the Empire instead, and the Empire had swallowed him, and she was standing in its stomach, and the walls were closing in, and the acid was rising, and somewhere in the distance, on a battlefield she would never see, a man who used to love her was swinging a sword at everything except the thing that was actually trying to kill them both. The candle on her nightstand flickered. The shadow on the wall moved, and Serafina Valhart, Queen of Verelion, pressed her back against the cold stone wall and whispered to the child inside her, "Hold on. Just hold on. We are going to survive this. Both of us. I swear it on every star in the sky that has never once answered my prayers." But the stars, as always, said nothing. And in the corridor outside her locked door, footsteps gathered in the dark. You said, Part 2. Với tư cách là một người kể chuyện và biên kịch điện ảnh chuyên nghiệp, hãy triển khai Part 2 của kịch bản dựa trên diễn biến đã kết thúc ở Part 1. Part 2.
Với tư cách là một người kể chuyện và biên kịch điện ảnh chuyên nghiệp, hãy triển khai part 2 của kịch bản dựa trên diễn biến đã kết thúc ở part 1. Mục tiêu là tạo ra một bản thảo lồng tiếng dày dặn, giàu tính phản biện và kịch tính để phục vụ video YouTube dài 2 tiếng. Yêu cầu kỹ thuật và giá trị tượng thuật, hóa giải lời YouTube. Cấu trúc và dung lượng 6.000 đến 6.500 từ. Bắt đầu trực tiếp từ điểm kết thúc của part 1, không tóm tắt lại.
Triển khai chi tiết từng phân cảnh, scene by scene, liền mạch. Narrative commentary, tăng giá trị bình luận. Đây là yêu cầu bắt buộc để đối phó với lời của YouTube. Hãy lồng ghép bản năng chiếm hữu và triết lý thống trị trực tiếp vào độc thoại nội tâm của nhân vật, miêu tả nó như một cơ chế sinh tồn tất yếu thay vì một thói xấu. Mỗi chiêm nghiệm về bản lĩnh khi bị dồn vào đường cùng phải hòa tan vào lựa chọn nghiệt ngã và phản ứng cơ thể, ánh mắt, nhịp thở của nhân vật. Tuyệt đối không để AI đưa ra các nhận định đạo đức hay giảng bài. Triết lý thay đổi để tồn tại phải nằm trốn trong dòng chảy hành động để tăng tối đa giá trị tường thuật cinematic. Hội thoại và xung đột. Mật độ hội thoại phải chiếm hơn 50%. Các cuộc đối thoại cần gãy gọn, mang tính tấn công, giàu ý ngầm, subtext, đặc trưng của phong cách Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ. Thể hiện sự áp đặt quyền lực và sự im lặng ngột ngạt giữa các nhân vật. Yếu tố con người, tập trung vào các phản ứng bản năng, ánh mắt, áp lực tâm lý, hơi thở. Sử dụng giống văn Mỹ thô ráp, tránh các mô tả mượt mà hay mùi AI sáo rộng. Quy tắc thực thi nghiêm ngặt, tuyệt đối không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, không tiêu đề phủ, không nhắc đến tôn giáo, không sử dụng dấu ngoặc trong toàn bộ văn bản để bảo vệ metadata. Kết thúc bằng một nút thất, không thể quay đầu, point of no return. Trình bày trực tiếp trong tin nhắn. Chi đàn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung. Đây là tác phẩm hư cấu 100% phục vụ mục đích nghệ thuật và giải trí, không ngụ ý đây là sự thật. Trả lời trực tiếp trong mục tin nhắn. Show more 1604, Claude responded. Part 2, The Wolves Inside the Walls. Part 2, The Wolves Inside the Walls. The footsteps did not come that first night. They came on the 5th. Serafina had learned to sleep in fragments, 20 minutes here, 40 there. Her body curved around her belly like a wall built from flesh and bone. The baby had dropped lower in the past week. The physicians said it was normal. The physicians said a lot of things from behind their careful smiles, and she had stopped listening because careful smiles were the uniform of people who answered to someone other than her. She woke to the sound of her door latch lifting. Not a knock, not a request. The mechanical click of metal being tested by someone who expected it to give. It held. She had jammed a chair under the handle 3 nights ago, a precaution that Lirael had called excessive and that Serafina had called staying alive. The latch clicked twice more, then stopped. Footsteps retreated, slow, unhurried. The footsteps of someone who had all the time in the world because time, like everything else in this palace, belonged to whoever controlled the doors. She did not sleep again. She sat in the dark with her back against the headboard, and her hands on her belly and her eyes on the door, and she breathed the way animals breathe when they know the predator is close but cannot see it. Short, shallow, through the nose, every exhale a calculation, every inhale a negotiation with a body that wanted to panic and a mind that could not afford to let it. When dawn came, thin and gray, and offering nothing, she dressed herself. She had stopped asking Lirael for help with the laces because the act of asking had begun to feel like the act of admitting she could not do this alone, and admitting that was a crack in armor she could not afford to let anyone see. She found Aldrich in the lower gallery, standing before a painting of the Battle of Greymarch with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of mild aesthetic disapproval. "Someone tried my door last night," she said. Aldrich did not turn. He studied the painting as if it contained information more urgent than what she had just told him. "Tried," he said, "not entered. The distinction seems less important from my side of the door." He turned then. His eyes moved over her face with the clinical precision of a man assessing damage. "You look thin, my queen. I am growing a human being inside my body while people try to break into my room at night. Thin seems like a reasonable outcome." He was quiet for a moment. The gallery was empty, but emptiness in this palace was its own kind of lie. Walls had ears, paintings had eyes. Every shadow was a potential witness in a court where testimony was currency. "Marin Duskwood held counsel last night," Aldrich said. His voice dropped to the register reserved for information that could get a man killed. He has recalled the Queen's personal guard and reassigned them to the outer wall. Your chambers are now protected by palace sentries who report directly to the council, so my guards have been replaced by his guards. Your guards have been replaced by men who will do whatever Marin tells them to do, which is a distinction worth understanding. He paused. There is more. Lady Thessara has been formally appointed as the king's diplomatic envoy to the eastern provinces. The council ratified it unanimously. Serafina felt something move through her that was not the baby. It was colder, sharper. The specific kind of understanding that arrives not as a thought, but as a sensation, the way you feel a blade before you see the blood. They are replacing me, she said. Not removing, replacing. One piece at a time, like pulling stones from a wall until the whole thing comes down under its own weight. Aldrich's mouth thinned. That is one interpretation. Give me another. He did not. They stood in the gallery with the painted dead watching from their frames, and the silence between them was the silence of two people who had arrived at the same conclusion from different directions, and found no comfort in the convergence. What are my options? She said. Limited. The palace is effectively sealed. Correspondence is reviewed by the council before dispatch. Your household staff has been reduced to Lirael and 2 chamber servants, and the treasury has frozen your personal accounts under the pretext of wartime austerity. So I am a prisoner. You are a queen whose authority has been suspended by men who understand that authority is not a birthright, but a supply chain, and they have cut every line that feeds yours. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. The stone was cold. Everything in this palace was cold. The walls, the floors, the people. As if warmth were a resource that had been rationed out of existence. And Veilor? Does he know? Aldrich looked at her with something that might have been pity if pity were an emotion he could afford. The king is 300 miles north, fighting a war on 4 fronts. The information that reaches him is curated by the same council that is dismantling your position. He knows what they want him to know, which is that the palace is secure, the queen is well, and the empire is functioning in his absence. So he thinks everything is fine. He thinks what powerful men always think when they leave their house to go conquer someone else's. That the walls will hold, the locks will keep, and the people inside will stay exactly where he put them. She closed her eyes. The baby shifted, a slow tidal movement, and she felt the pressure change in her lower back, a deep ache that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. 6 weeks. Maybe less. The child was coming whether the world was ready or not, and the world, as far as she could tell, was spectacularly unready. I need to get a message to him, she said. Aldrich exhaled. Every courier passes through the council checkpoint at the northern gate. Every letter is opened, read, and resealed. I have watched them do it. They are not even discreet about it because discretion implies shame, and shame requires a conscience, and consciences are in short supply among men who smell an opportunity. Then find me another way. He studied her. She held his gaze. Whatever he saw there, it changed something in his calculation, some variable he had been carrying that shifted weight from one side of the ledger to the other. There is a man, he said slowly, a farrier who shoes the cavalry horses at the northern staging camp. He passes through the palace grounds every 8 days to collect requisition orders. He is not a courier. He is not political. He is a man who puts metal on the feet of horses and does not care who rides them. I can get a message to him, but I cannot guarantee it reaches the king, and I cannot guarantee that sending it does not get both of us killed. Do it. My queen, do it, Aldrich. I do not care about the risk. I care about my child being born in a palace controlled by men who see that child as an obstacle. Get the message to Veilor. Tell him the wolves are inside the walls. Tell him his queen is running out of room. Tell him to come home, or there will be nothing left to come home to. Aldrich bowed. It was a deeper bow than usual, and when he straightened, his face had rearranged itself into something harder, something that had stopped calculating odds and started accepting them. He left. Serafina stood in the gallery alone. The painted battle on the wall showed men dying in careful brushstrokes, their agony preserved in pigment and oil, and she thought, that is what history does. It makes suffering beautiful. It puts a frame around it and hangs it on a wall and invites people to admire the composition while forgetting that every stroke of red was someone's last breath. She put her hand on her belly. The baby kicked. hard enough to make her gasp.
"I know," she whispered. "I know. We are running out of time." 300 miles north, Valor Draven stood in mud up to his ankles and watched the Ashenmere crossing burn. The bridge was 200 years old. Stone and timber and the accumulated weight of 10,000 crossings by merchants, armies, lovers, refugees, all of it going up in a column of orange and black that stained the evening sky like a wound. The rebels had packed the support pillars with pitch and sulfur and timed the ignition to coincide with the arrival of Valor's forward cavalry, and the explosion had taken 32 horses and 19 men and the last viable crossing point within 100 miles. Torvald stood beside him. The general's face was blank in the way that military faces go blank when the situation has outpaced the available vocabulary for describing it. "They knew we were coming," Torvald said. Valor said nothing. His eyes reflected the fire. His jaw was a locked mechanism, a gear that had seized under pressure and refused to turn. The mud sucked at his boots. The smoke burned his nostrils. Somewhere downstream, a horse was screaming, a high, wet, broken sound that went on too long. "Who knew the route?" Valor said. "The command staff. The quartermaster. The council received a copy of the deployment schedule for resource allocation." The council. A statement, not a question. Valor's eyes did not move from the burning bridge. The fire had reached the central span and the stone was cracking, great shards of it dropping into the river with sounds like bones breaking. "Pull the eastern column back to the ridgeline," Valor said. "Establish a defensive perimeter at half a mile. No fires tonight. No tents. Every man sleeps in his armor with his weapon within reach." "We are retreating? We are repositioning." "Retreating is what I do when I have no other option. Repositioning is what I do when I have been betrayed and need time to decide who dies for it." Torvald did not argue. He had served Valor for 9 years and had learned that the king's quiet voice was infinitely more dangerous than his loud one. The loud voice was theater. The quiet voice was the sound of a man crossing names off a list. The camp that night was a grim thing. 3,000 men spread along a ridgeline in the dark. No fires. The cold settling into their armor like water into stone. Valor walked the line because he always walked the line. Because his father had told him once that a king who does not know the faces of his soldiers does not deserve their deaths. And Valor had taken that lesson and sharpened it into something his father would not have recognized. He stopped at the forward position where a young soldier, barely 20, sat hunched against a rock with a crossbow across his knees and eyes that were too wide for the darkness to explain. "Name," Valor said. The soldier startled. "Doran, my king. Doran Ashford, 3rd Infantry, 2nd Pike." Valor crouched beside him. This close, the soldier could see the scar, the mud on the king's face, the way his eyes caught what little light existed and held it like a trap. "First campaign, Doran?" "Yes, my king." "Scared?" The soldier hesitated. The correct answer was no. The truthful answer was written across his face in sweat and shallow breathing. "Yes, my king," he said. Valor looked at him, looked through him, into the place where fear lived, the place Valor himself had boarded up years ago with oak and iron and the accumulated weight of every life he had taken. "Good," Valor said. "Fear means your body knows something your mind has not accepted yet. Do not fight it. Use it. When the time comes, let it sharpen you instead of shatter you. That is the only difference between a soldier who survives and a soldier who does not. Not courage, not training. The ability to be terrified and still move forward." He stood. He walked on. The soldier watched him go, and in the darkness, Doran Ashford made a decision about what kind of man he wanted to be, and that decision would keep him alive for exactly 11 more days. Valor reached his command tent at midnight. It was not really a tent. It was a canvas lean-to stretched between 2 trees, open on 3 sides because Valor did not trust walls he had not built himself. He sat on a fallen log and pulled a map from his saddlebag and spread it across his knees and stared at it until the lines blurred and the rivers became veins and the mountains became bones, and the whole landscape rearranged itself into the anatomy of something dying. The supply route from the capital ran along the western valley. 3 days' travel under normal conditions. Under these conditions, with the bridge gone and the rebel forces controlling the eastern passes, it might as well have been 3 months. His army was cut off, not encircled, not yet,
but isolated in a way that turned every day into a subtraction. Food, water, morale, all of it leaking out of the margins.
He should have been thinking about flanking maneuvers, river crossings, logistics, the mathematics of survival that had kept him alive through 14 campaigns and 6 sieges and 1 night in Carvos that he still could not remember without his hands shaking. Instead, he was thinking about Serafina,
The way she had looked at him in his study, the stillness of her face, the flatness of her voice when she said the Empire, and he had said the Empire. And the word had come out of his mouth like a reflex, automatic, the same way his arm moved to block a sword, because the Empire was his armor, and he had worn it so long that he had forgotten it was not his skin. She had asked him to choose. Standing there with his child inside her, she had asked him to choose. And he had chosen the Empire because the Empire was the only thing that had never betrayed him, never abandoned him, never looked at him with disappointment or grief, or the particular kind of love that comes with conditions. The Empire asked nothing of him except strength. The Empire rewarded nothing except results. The Empire was clean in a way that human relationships were not. And Valor had spent his entire life building something clean because the alternative was the mess of loving and losing and the intolerable vulnerability of needing someone who could leave. He folded the map. He pressed his palms against his eyes. The smoke from the burning bridge was still in his lungs, and every breath tasted like failure. Torvain approached from the tree line. "My king, a rider from the south, at this hour." He came off the road, through the forest, no colors, no banner. He asked for you by name. Valor's hand moved to the sword at his hip. Instinct. The first language he had ever learned and the last one he would forget. Bring him. The man was thin, weathered, with the kind of face that belonged behind a forge rather than on a horse. His hands were calloused in the wrong places for a soldier. The pads of his fingers thickened, the knuckles permanently dark with soot. A farrier. Valor recognized the markers the way a predator recognizes the markings of a species that is not prey automatically, without interest. "You asked for me," Valor said. The farrier knelt, not elegantly, not practiced, the kneel of a man who understood the concept but had never needed to execute it. "I carry a message, my king. From the palace." Valor went still, completely, utterly still, the way a lake goes still before a stone breaks its surface. "Who sent you?" "Lord Aldrich Voss. On behalf of the Queen." Torvain stepped forward. "My king, this could be—" "Let him speak." Valor's eyes did not leave the farrier's face. "What is the message?" The farrier swallowed. He was afraid. Not of the king specifically, but of the weight of the words he carried. Words that did not belong in his mouth. Words that were too heavy for a man who worked in iron and leather and the simple geometry of horseshoes. The queen says the wolves are inside the walls. She says the council has taken the palace guard, the treasury, the correspondence. She says Lord Marin Duskwood has been appointed regent and your queen has been made a prisoner in everything but name. She says to come home. She says there will be nothing left to come home to. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a man recalculating every assumption he had made in the past month and watching them collapse one by one like a row of columns under an earthquake. Valor's face did not change, his posture did not shift, but something behind his eyes ignited, something old and deep and rooted in a part of him that predated the crown, predated the empire, predated everything except the raw animal imperative to protect what was his. "How long ago?" Valor said. His voice was the quietest thing in the forest. 5 days. I rode without stopping. 2 horses died under me. Valor turned to Torvain. The general saw the king's face and took one involuntary step backward, not out of fear but out of recognition. He had seen this expression once before, at Carvos, in the 9 minutes before the gate fell, when Valor had stopped being a king and started being something far older and far more dangerous. "How fast can we move the army south?" Valor said. "The full force?" 2 weeks minimum. "The terrain?" "Not the full force. A strike column, 200 mounted soldiers, the best riders, the best blades." "How fast?" Torvain's jaw worked. 4 days. Maybe 3 if we kill the horses. "Then we kill the horses." Valor stood. He was not tall enough for his shadow to cover the entire clearing, but it felt like it did. "Select the men.
We ride at first light. Leave the infantry under Commandant Raylan with orders to hold the ridge and engage no one until I return. My king. Torvain's voice was careful, the voice of a man walking along the edge of a blade. If you pull 200 riders south, the northern front.
The northern front is a distraction, Veilor said. The words came out hard, bitten off at the edges. They burned the bridge to fix our eyes here, to keep us looking north while they take the palace. This rebellion was never about the border, Torvan. It was about the throne. And while I have been standing in mud watching bridges burn, my wife has been alone in a palace full of men who want my crown badly enough to go through her to get it. He turned to the farrier. You. What is your name? Heron. My king. Heron Cole. Heron Cole. You rode 5 days through hostile territory with no weapon, no escort, and no guarantee that I would not have you killed for arriving unannounced in my camp. The farrier looked at the ground. The queen asked, My king. She asked, and I went because someone had to go and no one else was willing. Veilor studied him for a long moment. Then he reached to his belt and unhooked a dagger in a leather sheath and held it out. When this is over, Heron Cole, come find me. I pay my debts. The farrier took the dagger with hands that shook. He did not speak. Some gestures are too large for words, and gratitude from a man like Veilor Draven was a thing you held carefully, the way you hold a lit match in a room full of gunpowder. The column rode at dawn, 200 men on fresh horses, moving south through the forest at a pace that turned the trees into a blur of green and brown, and the ground into a drumroll of hooves that could be heard for miles. Veilor rode at the front because he always rode at the front, but this time the position was not theater. It was velocity. He was the point of the spear, and the spear was aimed at the heart of his own kingdom. And the paradox of it, that the greatest threat to his empire had been growing inside its walls, while he searched for enemies outside them, was a lesson that burned in his chest like swallowed fire. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He drank water from his canteen while the horse galloped and the wind cut his face, and the scar on his temple throbbed with a pulse that was separate from his heartbeat. A second clock ticking inside his skull, counting down to something he could not name and could not stop. On the second night, camped in a ravine with the horses steaming in the cold, Torvain found him sitting alone on a rock, staring south. You should rest, my king. You have not slept in...
How long has Marin Duskwood been planning this? Torvain was quiet for a moment. It is hard to say, my king. Marin has always been ambitious, but ambition and treason are different animals. One grazes, the other hunts.
And I fed him. Veilor's voice was stripped bare. No authority, no performance, the raw sound of a man talking to himself in the dark. I put him on the council. I gave him access to the treasury, the military dispatches, the palace infrastructure. I gave him everything he needed to tear apart my house from the inside because I was too busy building walls on the outside to notice that the foundation was rotting. He picked up a stone, turned it in his fingers, dropped it. She told me, he said. Seraphina. She stood in my study and told me to choose, and I chose wrong, Torvain. I stood there and told her the empire comes first, and I believed it because believing it was easier than admitting that I am afraid. I have conquered 11 kingdoms, and I am afraid of a woman with green eyes and a voice that shakes when she is trying not to cry, because she is the only person in the world who has ever seen me without the crown and loved what she saw. And that terrifies me more than any army, because an army can only kill me, and she can do something worse. She can leave. She can look at me and decide that what she sees is not enough, and I will have no wall, no sword, no throne to hide behind. Torvain said nothing. In 9 years of service, he had never heard the king speak like this. He had heard Veilor give orders that killed hundreds. He had heard him negotiate treaties that redrew the maps of nations. He had heard him laugh exactly 4 times. But he had never heard him afraid. We will reach the palace in 2 days, Torvain said finally. Veilor looked at him. His eyes were red-rimmed. His jaw was dark with stubble. He looked, for the first time in Torvain's memory, like a man instead of a monument. If she is hurt, Veilor said, I will pull that palace apart stone by stone with my bare hands. And when I reach the bottom, when there is nothing left but rubble and dust and the bones of every man who touched her, I will build it again. I will build it the way I should have built it from the beginning, with her name on every stone. Torvan believed him. Not because the words were poetic, but because they were not. They were the flat, factual statements of a man describing what he intended to do the way an engineer describes a structure, load-bearing calculations, material requirements, timelines. Valor was not making a promise. He was drawing a blueprint. They rode on. In the palace, the air had changed. Serafina could taste it, metallic, charged, the atmospheric pressure of something about to break. The council had grown bolder. Marin Duskwood now occupied the king's study, sat in the king's chair, and received petitions from the king's desk with the practiced ease of a man trying on a coat that did not belong to him and finding that it fit. Lyril brought the news in whispers, standing close enough that their shoulders touched, speaking into Serafina's ear like a woman feeding secrets to a conspirator. He has dismissed the queen's household staff entirely. Your seamstress, your cook, your physician, all reassigned. He says it is an efficiency measure. He says the wartime budget requires sacrifice. Serafina sat on the edge of her bed. The baby was low now, so low that standing for more than 10 minutes sent bolts of pressure down her legs. Her back ached with a constancy that had become its own kind of silence, a pain so persistent that it disappeared into the background of her consciousness and only reasserted itself when she tried to do something radical, like stand or walk or breathe deeply. And my physician? The one who is supposed to deliver this child in 3 weeks? Reassigned to the military infirmary. The council has appointed a replacement, a man named Corvin Thale. Serafina looked at Lyril. Do I know that name? He served as Marin Duskwood's personal physician for 6 years before joining the palace medical staff. He is loyal to Marin. He is inside Marin's coat, my queen, stitched into the lining. So when I go into labor, the man delivering my child will be working for the man who is trying to take my crown. Lyril's face tightened. Yes, my queen. Serafina pressed both hands against her belly. The baby was still. Too still. The kicks that had been constant companions for months had slowed in the past 2 days, and the silence inside her was worse than any blow Marin Duskwood could deliver because it was the silence of something she could not protect with words or wit or the dwindling currency of her title. I need you to do something for me, Serafina said. Anything. I need you to find me a way out of this palace. Not out of the city, not out of the kingdom, just out of this building. A servant's passage, a supply tunnel, a drainage channel. Anything that leads to the other side of these walls. Because if this child comes while Marin controls the infirmary and the physician and the guards outside my door, I will be delivering my baby in the hands of a man who has every reason to make sure that delivery goes wrong. Lyril stared at her. My queen, in your condition, any passage would... I am not asking what is safe, Lyril. I am asking what is possible. Safe stopped being an option the night someone tried my door. Possible is what I have left. Find me possible. Lyril left. The door closed. Serafina sat alone in the chamber that had once been her sanctuary, the room where Valor had first held her, where they had spent early mornings tangled in sheets and silence and the lazy warmth of 2 bodies that had not yet learned to keep score. The curtains were drawn. The candles were lit. And on the nightstand beside the bed, a small wooden box held a piece of paper on which Valor had written years ago, in his terrible handwriting, a single line that she had read so many times the ink was fading. She did not open the box. She did not need to. The words were burned into her memory the way his scar was burned into his face, permanent, indelible, a mark left by something that should have killed but instead transformed. A sound. Not footsteps this time, something heavier. The groan of a hinge that had not been opened in months. It came from the wall behind the wardrobe, a section of stone that looked identical to every other section but apparently was not, because the sound came again, louder, and then the scrape of something moving against something else. Stone on stone. And Serafina stood, too fast, the blood rushing from her head, and grabbed the bedpost and held on. The wardrobe shuddered, moved, slid 3 inches to the left on the stone floor with a sound like a coffin lid being pushed aside. A figure emerged from the dark space behind it. Not Larael, not Aldrich. A man she did not recognize, dressed in the uniform of the palace sentries, his face half covered by a cloth pulled up over his nose, his eyes visible and nothing else. And those eyes were not the eyes of a man who had come to help. He saw her. She saw him. And in the space between scene and acting, which lasted exactly 1 second but felt like the rest of her life, Serafina Valhart did not scream. She did not freeze. She grabbed the iron candlestick from the nightstand and swung it with both hands at the place where his head met his neck, and the impact sent a shock through her arms and into her shoulders, and the man staggered sideways and hit the wardrobe, and she swung again, harder. The candlestick heavy and wrong in her grip, but effective, brutally effective, and the man dropped to one knee, and she brought it down a third time on the crown of his skull, and he collapsed. She stood over him, breathing hard, the candlestick dripping wax and something darker onto the stone floor. Her belly tight, tighter than it should have been, a band of pressure that wrapped around her middle and squeezed. "No," she said. Her voice was steady, and her hands were not. "Not now. Not here. Hold on. You hold on." The baby did not answer. The contraction passed. She stepped over the fallen man and looked into the dark passage he had emerged from and saw nothing but black and cold and the smell of earth and iron and the knowledge, absolute and total, that this palace was no longer a place where she would survive. She turned. She moved to the door. She pulled the chair away and opened it and stepped into the corridor, and the corridor was empty, and the torches threw shadows that moved like living things against the walls. And Serafina Valhart, Queen of Varelion, 7 months pregnant and holding a bloodied candlestick in her shaking hands, began to walk. She did not know where she was going. She knew where she was not staying. Behind her, in the chamber, the man on the floor began to stir. And 3 floors below, in the king's study that was no longer the king's, Marin Duskwood looked up from his desk and smiled the smile of a man whose trap has just been sprung, not realizing that the thing he had caught was not the thing he had been hunting, and the thing he had been hunting was 2 days south, riding through the dark with 200 swords and a rage that had no name and no limit and no intention of stopping until the walls of the palace were painted with the consequences of what he was about to find. Serafina reached the end of the corridor. The torchlight did not reach here. The darkness was complete. She stopped. She pressed her back against the wall. She felt the second contraction hit, harder than the first, a fist inside her closing around something vital, and she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold stone floor in the absolute dark, with her hands around her belly and her teeth clenched against the sound that was trying to escape her throat. And she heard them. Footsteps. Coming from both directions now. Behind her and ahead of her. Converging. The candlestick lay across her knees, the darkness pressed against her eyes. And Serafina Valhart, alone in the belly of the beast that her husband had built and then abandoned, made a choice. Not a brave choice or a smart choice, but the only choice left to a woman who had been stripped of everything except the life growing inside her and the iron in her hands and the flat, unbreakable refusal to let either one go. She stood up, she faced the dark, and the footsteps came closer. The footsteps behind her were faster, the footsteps ahead were slower. Serafina's mind, sharpened to a blade by months of isolation and 3 minutes of violence, processed the difference the way a hunted animal processes wind direction. The fast ones were chasing, the slow ones were waiting, which meant the corridor ahead was not an escape route but a funnel, and she was being driven toward its mouth. She stopped walking. She pressed herself into an alcove where the torchlight from the intersecting hallway did not reach and held the candlestick against her chest, and made herself as small as a woman 7 months pregnant can make herself, which was not small enough, not nearly, but the darkness helped, and the darkness was the only thing in this palace that was still on her side. The fast footsteps arrived first. 2 men. She could tell by the rhythm, one heavier than the other, their boots striking the stone in a staggered pattern that sounded like a broken heartbeat. They passed the alcove. They did not look. They were moving with the single-minded urgency of men following an order, and the order was evidently to move forward, toward the slow footsteps, toward the mouth of the funnel where she was supposed to be. She waited until their sound faded. Then she turned and went back the way she had come, past her own chamber where the door still hung open, and the man she had struck was gone, which meant he was awake, which meant the passage behind the wardrobe was still open, and what had been an entrance for her attacker became, in the desperate arithmetic of the moment, her only exit. She slipped through the opening behind the wardrobe. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for her belly, and the stone on either side pressed against her like the walls of a birth canal. And the metaphor was so precise and so cruel that she almost laughed. Almost. The laugh died in her throat because the third contraction hit, and this one was different. This one had teeth. It bit down on her lower abdomen with a pressure that turned her vision white at the edges and buckled her knees. She caught herself against the wall, both palms flat on wet stone, her forehead pressed against the cold, her breathing ragged, animal, stripped of everything civilized and reduced to the fundamental transaction of oxygen in and carbon out, and the desperate negotiation between a body that wanted to collapse and a will that would not allow it. "Not yet," she said through her teeth. The words were not a plea. They were a command, issued to her own muscles, her own blood, her own child. "Not yet. We are not safe. We are not anywhere. Hold on." The contraction passed. She straightened. She moved forward into the dark. The passage descended. Steep, uneven steps cut into the stone, slick with condensation, and something organic that she did not want to identify. The air changed as she went deeper, growing colder, damper, carrying the mineral smell of earth and the faint sweetness of rot. This was old construction, older than the palace above, possibly older than the kingdom itself. The kind of infrastructure that empires build on top of and forget about, the bones beneath the skin. She counted steps. 37, 42, 50. At 60, the passage leveled and widened into a low chamber with a vaulted ceiling and a floor of packed earth. 3 tunnels branched from it like the fingers of an open hand, each one offering darkness and uncertainty and the possibility of something worse than what she had left behind. She chose the leftmost tunnel because it sloped upward, and upward meant closer to the surface, and the surface meant air and light, and the theoretical possibility of a world that was not trying to crush her. She was wrong. The tunnel ended at an iron gate, locked, its bars green with oxidation and set into stone that had been there long enough to grow lichen in the seams. Beyond the gate she could see a courtyard, moonlit, empty, the flagstones silver and blue in the cold light. The eastern courtyard. She recognized the fountain, a stone lion with water that had not run in years, its mouth open in a silent roar that had become, over time, a kind of architectural despair. She gripped the bars. Pulled. The iron did not move. The lock was old but solid, the mechanism seized with rust and time, and she did not have a key and she did not have the strength, and she was standing in a tunnel beneath her own palace, locked out of her own courtyard. And the absurdity of it, the queen caged beneath the kingdom, was so complete that something inside her shifted. Not broke. Shifted. The way tectonic plates shift before an earthquake, a deep rearrangement of internal geography that changes the landscape permanently. She sat down on the tunnel floor with her back against the gate, the iron bars pressed into her spine. The earth was cold beneath her. The baby was quiet, terribly quiet, and the silence from inside her belly was louder than every sound in the world above. Footsteps. Again. Behind her, from the branching chamber, the scrape of boots on stone and the thin beam of a lantern cutting through the dark. She gripped the candlestick. She did not stand. She could not. The contractions were coming every few minutes now, irregular but insistent, and her body had begun to make decisions without consulting her mind, diverting blood and energy to the process it had been preparing for, a process that did not care about locked gates or dark tunnels or men with lanterns. "My queen." The voice was Aldrich's. She recognized it before the lantern light reached his face, because his voice had a specific quality, dry and precise, and carrying the faint undertone of a man who found the world consistently disappointing but remained committed to navigating it. He emerged from the tunnel. Lyrael was behind him, her face tight with fear and effort, carrying a bundle of cloth and a leather satchel. "How did you find me?" Seraphina said. "The man you hit woke up and started shouting. Lyrael saw you enter the passage before the guards arrived. We followed." Aldrich crouched beside her. The lantern threw his shadow up the wall behind him, grotesque and elongated, a caricature of a man rendered in light and stone. "You are having contractions," he said. "Not a question. I am aware." "How far apart?" "Close enough that sitting in a tunnel seems like a poor strategic choice." She looked at him. In the lantern light, his face was all angles and hollows, the face of a man who had survived the court not through strength or charm, but through the simple, relentless application of intelligence to every situation, including the ones that did not deserve it. "The physician," she said. "Corvin Thaler. Marin's man." That is who will deliver this baby if we go back up. We are not going back up. Aldrich reached into his coat and produced a key, black iron, old, hanging from a leather cord. He stood, stepped past her, and fitted the key into the gate lock. It turned with a sound like a knuckle cracking. The gate swung open. "How long have you had that?" Serafina asked. "Long enough." There are things in this palace that predate every king who has sat on that throne, and there are people who keep track of those things because someone has to, and because the men who wear the crowns are always too busy looking up to notice what is under their feet. They moved through the courtyard, staying in the shadows along the wall. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to see by, bright enough to be seen by, and Serafina moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a woman whose body was waging a war on two fronts, labor, advancing from within, and danger pressing from without. Aldrich led them to a low building at the courtyard's edge, a structure she had never noticed because it was the kind of building that palaces accumulate over centuries, repurposed and forgotten and repurposed again until its original function is lost to everyone except the people who maintain the plumbing. A pump house, stone walls, a wooden roof, a single door that Aldrich opened with another key from the seemingly inexhaustible collection inside his coat. Inside was small, dark, warm. An iron stove in the corner unlit, a wooden bench along one wall. A table with a basin and a jug of water that Liriel must have placed here earlier because the water was still cool, which meant she had known about this place, which meant Aldrich had known, which meant that someone in this palace had been planning for exactly this scenario while Serafina had been sitting in her chamber counting stars and waiting for a rescue that might never come. "You planned this," Serafina said. Aldrich closed the door. "I planned for the possibility that the palace would become untenable. I did not plan for you to assault a man with a candlestick and go wandering through medieval drainage tunnels while in premature labor, but I have learned to adapt." Liriel was already spreading the cloth on the bench, arranging the satchel, pulling out items that Serafina recognized as medical supplies, bandages, a small bottle of something amber, a pair of scissors that looked too clean and too sharp for their surroundings. "This is not how this was supposed to happen," Serafina said. Her voice cracked on the last word. Not the crack of weakness, but the crack of something harder, the sound of composure finally reaching the limit of what composure could contain. "I was supposed to be in a room with light and warmth, and a physician I trusted, and a husband who cared enough to be there. This is not how this was supposed to happen." No one spoke. The silence was thick with all the things that were supposed to happen and did not. Liriel knelt beside her and took her hand and held it, and the grip was fierce, the grip of a woman who understood that the world had failed her queen and that the only thing left was to be present for the failure. Aldrich moved to the door. He stood with his ear against the wood, listening. "I cannot deliver a child, Aldrich," Serafina said. "Not here. Not without help." Liriel has assisted in births before. Her mother was a midwife in the outer provinces. Serafina looked at Liriel. Her handmaiden. The thin, sharp-boned woman who had spent 3 years bringing tea and brushing hair and keeping secrets, and who was now, apparently, the only thing standing between Serafina and delivering a premature baby on a wooden bench in a pump house while the palace above them burned with conspiracy. Liriel met her eyes. "I will not let anything happen to you, my queen, or to the child. You cannot promise that." "No. But I can promise that I will be here and that I will not leave and that I will do everything I know how to do, which is more than you think, because my mother taught me before the court took me, and the court has not managed to undo all of her teaching yet." Another contraction. This one was longer, a sustained pressure that started in Serafina's back and wrapped around her middle like a belt being tightened by hands that did not know mercy. She gripped Liriel's hand. She gripped it until her knuckles went white and her nails left crescents in the other woman's skin, and the sound that came out of her was not a scream, but something lower, more fundamental. The sound of a body being reorganized by forces that predated language and civilization and the concept of queens and kings and empires. It passed. She breathed. The air tasted of stone and iron and the faintly sweet water from the basin. "How long?" Serafina said to Liriel. "How long will this take?" Liriel's face was calm. Her hands were steady. Whatever fear she carried, she had packed it into a compartment that did not show on her surface. And Serafina loved her for it in that moment with a fierceness that surprised her, a love born not of affection but of survival, the bond between two people who are standing in the same fire and have decided not to let go of each other. First births are unpredictable, Lirael said. Hours. Maybe many hours. Your body will tell us. We listen to your body, not the clock. Aldrich turned from the door. Someone is moving in the courtyard, 2 men, maybe 3, carrying lanterns. They are searching. For me, Serafina said. For you, my queen. She closed her eyes. The contractions were closer now, every 4 minutes, then 3. And each one was a wave that she had to ride from crest to trough without drowning, and the troughs were getting shallower, and the crests were getting higher, and the ocean inside her was not going to wait for permission to storm. 2 hours passed. The courtyard outside went quiet, then loud, then quiet again. The search parties moved in patterns that Aldrich tracked from the window, a narrow slit in the stone that looked out onto the eastern wall. He reported in clipped sentences, spare with detail, generous with implications. 3 groups. Systematic grid pattern. They have dogs. The dogs have not caught our scent yet, but the wind is shifting. Serafina did not respond. She was beyond responding. She was in the place that laboring women have occupied since the beginning of the species, a territory that exists outside of politics and strategy and the petty calculations of men who think power is something you hold in your hand. Her body had taken command. Her mind was a passenger, strapped in, watching the landscape change with every contraction, each one stronger, each one longer, each one pulling her deeper into the fundamental experience of creating a life from the raw material of her own blood and bone and breath. Lirael worked with the quiet competence of a woman who had watched her mother do this 100 times in farmhouses and barns, and once, if the stories were true, in the back of a wagon during a thunderstorm. She checked the dilation. She monitored the intervals. She spoke to Serafina in a low, steady voice that served as an anchor in the rising sea of pain. You are progressing fast, my queen. The baby wants to come. The baby does not care about Marin Duskwood or the palace guard or any of the rest of it. The baby only knows one direction, and that direction is out. 3 more hours. The moon moved across the sky. The candle Aldrich had lit in the stove flickered and threw shadows that danced on the walls like witnesses to a ritual that was older than any empire and more powerful than any throne. Aldrich left the pump house once, disappearing into the courtyard, and returning 7 minutes later with blood on his knuckles and a face that had rearranged itself into something Serafina had never seen on him before. Not anger, not fear. Satisfaction. The cold, surgical satisfaction of a man who had just removed an obstacle from the path. A sentry got too close, he said. He will not get close again. She did not ask what he had done. She did not care. The contractions were continuous now, one rolling into the next without the mercy of a break between them, and she was gripping the edge of the bench with both hands, and her teeth were clenched, and the sound coming from her was the sound of a woman being split open by the oldest force in the world. And she was not fighting it anymore, she was surrendering to it. Because fighting the body is a war you cannot win, and surrender is not weakness, but the recognition that some things are larger than the will. Push, Lirael said. When I tell you. Push. She pushed. The effort was total. Every muscle in her body recruited for a single purpose. Her back arching off the bench. Her thighs trembling. Sweat running into her eyes and mixing with tears. She did not know she was crying. She pushed, and the pain was a color, white, then red, then a color that did not have a name because the human mind had never needed to name it before. And she pushed again and felt something shift, something give, the terrible, beautiful, irreversible sensation of a body making room for another body. Again, Lirael said. Now. She pushed. The world contracted to a single point, the apex of effort and agony, and the blind, ferocious determination to bring this child into a world that did not deserve it. She pushed, and the pump house disappeared, and the palace disappeared, and the empire disappeared, and there was nothing in the universe except the space between her hips and the life that was trying to pass through it. And then, the silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of arrival. A new weight in the room. A new gravity. Lirael's hands moving, quick and certain, and then the sound that Serafina had been waiting for, the sound she had been building toward for 7 months, the sound that made every contraction and every humiliation and every cold night in an empty bed worth the price. The baby did not cry. Not immediately. There was a pause, a held breath that lasted 1 second or 1 century. And in that pause, Serafina felt the entire architecture of her being rearrange itself around a single, absolute, non-negotiable truth. Nothing else mattered. Not the crown, not the palace, not the empire, not the husband who had chosen gold over flesh. Nothing. Except this small, wet, furious creature that Lyriel was placing on her chest. The cry came, thin, angry. The first protest of a life that had entered the world in a pump house in the dark and had every right to object to the accommodations. "A girl," Lyriel said. Her voice was thick. "A girl, my queen." Serafina looked down at her daughter. The baby was small, too small. Her skin mottled red and purple, her fists clenched, her face screwed into an expression of pure existential outrage. She was covered in fluid and blood and the remains of the world she had just left, and she was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing Serafina had ever seen. She pressed her lips to the baby's forehead. The skin was hot, alive, real in a way that nothing in the palace had been real in months. "I am here," she whispered. "I am here, and I am not leaving. Not ever. Not for anyone." Aldrich appeared at her side. His face had changed again. The calculation was gone. The careful distance was gone. He was looking at the baby with an expression that Serafina recognized because she had seen it on her own face in the mirror. The expression of a person confronting something that is simultaneously fragile enough to destroy and powerful enough to rearrange the entire world around it. "She is early," Aldrich said quietly. "She is very early. I know, she needs warmth. She needs a physician. A real one, not Marin's puppet." "I know. The pump house cannot hide you both for long. By morning, the search will intensify. The dogs will find the tunnel. They will track you here." "I know, Aldrich. I know all of it. But right now in this exact moment, I do not care about any of it because my daughter is breathing, and that is enough. For this one moment, that is enough." He looked at her. The lantern light caught the planes of his face, and for the first time since she had known him, Lord Aldrich Voss looked like a man who had run out of strategies and found, in the vacancy, something that strategies could not provide. The baby nursed, weakly, struggling, her mouth working against the breast with an instinct that was older than consciousness. Serafina held her, and the heat between their bodies built a small country of warmth in the cold stone room, and for 15 minutes, maybe 20, the world outside did not exist. Then it came back. The sound started low. A distant thunder that was not thunder, but hooves. Many hooves. Coming from the south, from the valley road that led to the palace gates, and the rhythm was wrong for a normal approach. Too fast, too urgent. The cadence of riders who had been pushing their horses past the point of cruelty and had not stopped. Aldrich moved to the window. His body went rigid. His hand found the wall and pressed against it, and he stayed like that for 10 seconds, looking out, not moving, not breathing. "What is it?" Serafina said. "Banners," Aldrich said. His voice was strange. Black banners, silver crown. Serafina's heart stopped. Actually stopped. For one beat. A gap in the rhythm of her life that the baby felt and responded to with a small, involuntary jerk against her chest. "Valor," she said. "The king has come home." The palace erupted. She could hear it from the pump house, the distant shouting, the clash of metal, the sound of gates being forced open with the kind of violence that does not bother with keys or permissions. She heard the horses in the courtyard, the barked orders in a voice she knew better than her own heartbeat, a voice that carried authority the way a river carries current, not as a feature, but as a fundamental property. She held the baby tighter. Aldrich opened the pump house door. The courtyard was chaos. Soldiers in mud-caked armor pouring through the eastern gate, torches flaring, swords drawn. And at the center of it, dismounting from a horse that was foaming and wild-eyed and looked like it had been running for 3 days straight, was Vialor Draven. He looked like something the war had chewed up and refused to swallow. His armor was dented. His cloak was torn. The scar on his temple was livid, reopened or freshly irritated, a red line against skin that was gray with exhaustion and dust. His eyes were the only part of him that looked alive, and they were too alive, burning with something that was not anger and not fear, but the terrifying intersection of both, The place where a man who has spent his entire life controlling everything discovers that control is a story he has been telling himself, and the story just ended. Where is the queen? His voice hit the courtyard like a hammer on an anvil, flat, hard, ringing. Every soldier within earshot stopped moving. Every servant pressed against the nearest wall. Even the horses seemed to go still, as if the sound itself carried a weight that biological systems recognized as a threat. Marin Duskwood appeared at the top of the eastern staircase. He was dressed in sleeping clothes, a robe thrown hastily over his shoulders, his hair disordered, his face carrying the expression of a man who has been woken from a dream of power by the arrival of the reality that power was borrowed from. "My king," he said. His voice was smooth. Even now, even with 200 armed soldiers flooding his courtyard and a king standing in the center of it who looked like he had been assembled from rage and dust and the broken bones of horses, Marin Duskwood's voice was smooth. "We did not expect, where is the queen?" Each word was a separate sentence. Each sentence was a door being kicked in. Marin descended 3 steps. He raised his hands, palms out, the universal gesture of a man who wants you to believe he is not a threat while he calculates how much of one he actually is. "The queen is safe, my king. She is in her chambers, resting. The pregnancy has been... She is not in her chambers." Torvain stepped forward. He was holding his sword unsheathed. "We checked. The chambers are empty. The door is open. There is blood on the floor." The courtyard went silent. The particular silence that falls when every person in a space simultaneously realizes that the situation has moved beyond recovery and into the territory of consequence. Valor looked at Marin. The look lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, something happened behind Valor's eyes that was not a thought, but a geological event. Layers of assumption and trust and political calculation collapsing into each other like a sinkhole opening beneath a building. He had trusted Marin, not liked him, not respected him, but trusted him in the way that kings trust the machinery of their own government, the way you trust a bridge because you built it yourself and tested its weight, and never considered the possibility that someone might be dismantling it from below while you crossed. That trust died. It did not fade or erode. It died the way living things die, suddenly, with a specific moment of cessation, after which everything that follows is aftermath. "Seize him," Valor said. Soldiers moved. Marin stepped backward, his smooth composure cracking at the edges like lacquer in heat, and for the first time his true face was visible beneath the performance. The face of a man who had gambled everything on the king staying north long enough for the game to finish and had lost. "My king, this is a misunderstanding. The council acted in your absence to ensure stability. The queen was never in danger. I can explain." "You will explain." Valor walked toward the staircase. Each step was deliberate, weighted, the walk of a man who has crossed the distance between patience and violence and has no intention of crossing back. "You will explain every decision, every order, every reassigned guard and dismissed physician and sealed letter. You will explain it in detail, and then I will decide whether you live long enough to regret any of it." 2 soldiers took Marin by the arms. He did not resist. Resistance at this point was not strategy, but suicide. And Marin Duskwood, whatever else he was not a man who chose suicide when the alternative was time. Time to talk. Time to negotiate. Time to find the crack in Valor's fury that would allow something to survive. He would not find it, but he did not know that yet. Aldrich stepped out of the pump house. He stood in the courtyard with his hands at his sides and his face composed and waited until Valor's sweeping gaze found him. "Lord Voss." Valor's voice was a blade with no handle. Everyone who touched it bled. "Where is my wife?" Aldrich did not flinch. "She is here, my king. In the pump house. She is alive. She delivered your child 2 hours ago." The words hit Valor like a physical force. His body absorbed the impact the way a wall absorbs a cannon shot, visibly, structurally, with cracks appearing in places that had never shown weakness before. His mouth opened. Closed. His hands, which had been clenched into fists since he dismounted, went slack. His eyes, those burning, furious, calculating eyes, went wide and then went somewhere else entirely, somewhere private and devastating and utterly human. He walked to the pump house. He walked past Aldrich without seeing him. He walked past Torvain without hearing whatever Torvain said. He walked the way a man walks through a burning building toward the one room that contains everything he cannot afford to lose. He reached the door. He stopped. He could see her through the opening. She was sitting on the bench, her back against the stone wall, her hair matted with sweat, her gown stained with blood and fluid, and the evidence of everything she had endured while he was 300 miles away chasing a war that was designed to keep him there. She was holding a bundle against her chest, a small, still, impossibly small bundle wrapped in cloth that Lariel must have torn from her own clothing because the fabric was the plain gray of a servant's dress, not the silk or linen of a queen's nursery. She looked up. She saw him, and in her eyes he saw everything. Not anger, not relief, not love. Something beyond all of those. Something that contained all of those but exceeded them the way an ocean exceeds the individual waves that move across its surface. She looked at him, and she saw a man who had built an empire and lost a family and arrived too late to prevent the damage and just early enough to witness its aftermath. And the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who was trying to decide whether the man standing in the doorway was a rescue or just another disaster wearing a crown. "You came back," she said. Her voice was hoarse, shredded, the voice of a woman who had spent hours pushing a life out of her body in a pump house while the world above tried to destroy them both. He stepped inside. He knelt. Not the kneel of a king performing a gesture, but the kneel of a man whose legs had stopped working because the thing in front of him was too much for his body to process while standing. His knees hit the stone floor. His hands reached for her, stopped, hovered in the air between them, trembling, because Vaelor Draven's hands had not trembled since Carvos, and even then it was from the cold. "The baby," he said. She pulled the cloth back. The baby's face was visible, tiny, mottled. The features compressed into an expression of sleeping fury, lips pursed, fists clenched, as if even in sleep she was preparing to fight the world she had been born into. "A girl," Seraphina said. Vaelor looked at his daughter. He looked at her the way a man looks at an equation that invalidates every calculation he has ever made. The crown on his head, which he had not removed, which he had worn through 3 days of riding and mud and the systematic dismantling of every lie his court had told him, that crown suddenly weighed more than the palace above them. It weighed more than the empire. It weighed more than every kingdom he had ever conquered, and every life he had ever taken, and every wall he had ever built, because all of those things were abstractions, and the thing in front of him was not. "She is small," he said. His voice broke on the second word. Not dramatically, not cinematically. A hairline fracture, the kind you cannot see but can hear if you know what to listen for, the sound of structural integrity failing at the molecular level. "She came early," Seraphina said. "She came early because I was running through tunnels in the dark, because the palace you left me in tried to kill us both." He flinched. Vaelor Draven, the man who had held a gate at Carvos for 9 minutes, who had stared down 12 kings and made every one of them kneel, who had built Verelion from blood and ambition and the absolute refusal to show weakness, flinched. He reached out. His hand, scarred and calloused and shaking, touched the baby's cheek. The skin was impossibly soft, a softness that did not exist in his world, a material he had never encountered in 14 campaigns and 6 sieges and a lifetime of touching nothing but steel and stone and the rough edges of his own survival. The baby stirred, her eyes opened, briefly, unfocused, seeing nothing and everything, and then closed again. Something inside Vaelor Draven collapsed. Not broke. Collapsed. The distinction matters. Breaking is violent, sudden, a single event. Collapsing is structural. Collapsing is what happens when the load-bearing walls of a man's entire identity are removed simultaneously and everything they were holding up comes down at once. Not with a crash, but with a long, slow, grinding subsidence that changes the landscape permanently. He had built an empire. He had built it with his hands and his mind and the bodies of men who believed in him or feared him, or both. He had built walls and armies and systems of power that stretched across a continent, and none of it, not one stone, not one soldier, not one treaty, had been here when his wife needed him. None of it had stopped the men who tried her door at night. None of it had delivered his daughter in the dark. The empire he had chosen over his family had not protected his family. It had provided the very infrastructure of their destruction. He was kneeling on the floor of a pump house, and his wife was bleeding on a bench, and his daughter was wrapped in a servant's torn dress, and his crown was on his head, and the crown was the heaviest thing in the world. And for the first time in his life, Vialor Draven wanted to take it off. Not as a gesture, not as theater. He wanted to take it off because it was the thing that had caused all of this, the weight that had bent his spine until he could no longer see the ground where the people he loved were standing. He looked at Seraphina. She looked back at him. And in the space between them, which was 12 inches of air and 3 years of distance, and the unforgivable gap between the man he had been and the man she had needed him to be, something fundamental shifted. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not available at this price point, but she let him stay. She let him kneel there with his hand on their daughter's cheek and his armor pressing into the bench and his eyes wet with something he had not produced since he was a child and had long believed his body was no longer capable of manufacturing. Outside, the palace was being reclaimed. Soldiers moved through corridors. Marin Duskwood was being led to the lower cells. The council members were being rounded up one by one, pulled from their beds and their studies and their comfortable complicity. The machinery of consequence was engaging, gear by gear, and by morning, the political landscape of Aurelion would be unrecognizable. But inside the pump house, none of that existed. Inside the pump house, there was a man and a woman and a baby, and the terrible, luminous, devastating understanding that everything Valor had spent his life building was worthless compared to what he had almost lost. And what he had almost lost was breathing against his wife's chest, and what he had lost, the months, the trust, the presence, the simple act of being there, could never be rebuilt. Not by a king, not by an empire, not by all the gold in every wall he had ever gilded. The baby stirred, made a sound. Not a cry, a murmur, the quietest sound in the room and the loudest thing Valor had ever heard. He pressed his forehead against Seraphina's knee. His shoulders shook, the crown shifted on his head, tilted, and he reached up and removed it and set it on the floor beside him, and the gold sat on the cold stone like a discarded shell, empty, gleaming, meaningless. And outside, in the courtyard, a horse that had been ridden half to death stood in the moonlight with its head down and its sides heaving and steam rising from its coat like a soul, trying to leave a body that had carried it too far. And the steam rose into the sky and disappeared into the dark. And the dark, which had hidden conspiracies and betrayals, and a queen delivering a child in a forgotten room beneath the palace, the dark did not care about any of it. The dark simply waited for the sun. And the sun, when it came, would illuminate a kingdom that had changed in the night, not through conquest or treaty or the application of force, but through the one thing Valor Draven had never learned to wield, the willingness to put down the sword and hold the thing that was breaking and let himself break with it. But the baby was too small, and the morning was too cold, and when Lirael placed her hand on the infant's chest at dawn, her face told the story before her words did. My king, my queen. The child's breathing is wrong. She needs a physician, a real one, with medicines and warmth and time. And I do not know how much time we have. Valor looked at his daughter. He looked at the crown on the floor. He looked at the door, beyond which an empire waited for the man he used to be. And for the first time in his life, the Alpha King of Aurelion did not know what to do. He did not know what to do, so he did the only thing he had never tried. He asked, "What does she need?" His voice was stripped of command, stripped of authority, stripped of every layer of performance that had insulated him from the raw, unbearable experience of being a man who could not fix the thing that mattered most. He was looking at Lirael. His hands were still. His jaw was still. Everything about Valor Draven was still except his eyes, which were moving over his daughter's face with the frantic precision of a man searching a map for a road that might not exist. Lirael did not soften the answer. Warmth. Constant, sustained warmth. Her body cannot regulate its own temperature yet. She needs goat's milk or a wet nurse because the queen has been under too much stress and the milk may not come properly. She needs a physician who understands premature infants, not a battlefield surgeon, and not Marin's puppet. And she needs all of this within hours, not days. Her breathing is shallow. Her color is wrong. She is alive, my king. But alive is a temporary state for a baby this small without intervention. Valor stood. The movement was mechanical. his body executing a command his mind had already issued, and the command was simple. Move. Do something. Be the thing you have always been, the force that reshapes the world when the world is wrong. Except the world had never been wrong like this before. The world had been wrong with enemies and borders and political treachery, and he had fixed those wrongs with steel and strategy and the calculated application of violence. This was different. This was a 5-pound infant whose lungs were not finished yet, and violence could not build a lung, and strategy could not warm a body, and steel was the most useless material in the world when what you needed was milk and heat and time. He walked out of the pump house. The courtyard was gray with pre-dawn light, the kind of light that makes everything look provisional, unfinished, as if the world had not yet committed to being solid. His soldiers stood in clusters, exhausted, their horses tied to every post and railing the eastern courtyard could offer. Torvain was by the gate, speaking to a lieutenant whose face was smeared with mud and something darker. Torvain. The general turned. He saw Valor's face, and whatever he saw there made him take a step forward rather than backward, which was the instinct of a man who had served long enough to know that the king's most dangerous moments were also his most vulnerable ones. "I need a physician," Valor said. "Not from the palace staff. Someone from the outer city. A midwife, a healer, anyone who has kept a premature infant alive. I need goat's milk, fresh, within the hour. I need the queen's chambers cleared, cleaned, heated, and guarded by men who answer to me and only to me. And I need all of this done before the sun clears the eastern wall. Can you do that?" Torvain did not hesitate. "Yes, my king." "Then do it now." "And Torvain, the physician, find the best one. I do not care if you have to drag them from their bed. I do not care if they are drunk or asleep or in the middle of delivering someone else's child. My daughter is dying. Find someone who can stop that from happening." Torvain moved. He moved with the specific urgency of a man who has just received an order he understands not through its words, but through the thing behind its words, the raw terror that Valor had not bothered to disguise because disguising it would have cost time, and time was the only currency that mattered now. Valor went back inside. Serafina had not moved. She was holding the baby against her chest, skin to skin, the cloth pulled back, her body wrapped around the infant like a furnace that was running out of fuel. Her lips were blue-white, her eyes were closed. She was shivering, but the shivering was not from cold. It was from the sustained effort of producing heat for a body that could not produce its own, the metabolic cost of keeping another person alive through sheer biological will. He knelt beside her again. He removed his gauntlets. He removed his vambraces. He unbuckled the chest plate of his armor and let it fall to the floor with a clatter that made the baby flinch and then go still again. And the stillness was worse than the flinch, because the flinch was a reaction, and a reaction meant the nervous system was working, and stillness meant nothing or everything, and he could not tell which. "Give her to me," he said. Serafina opened her eyes. She looked at him. The look lasted 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds she conducted an assessment that was older and more reliable than any military evaluation Valor had ever performed. She assessed not his competence, but his intent. Not whether he could hold the baby, but whether he would. Whether the man kneeling in front of her was the same man who had told her the empire comes first, or whether something had changed, something fundamental, something structural, and whether that change was real or just another performance in a life that had been nothing but performance for 12 years. She saw something. Whatever it was enough. She transferred the baby. The motion was slow, careful, the choreography of 2 people moving a fragile object between them with the understanding that a mistake was not an option because the margin for error was the width of a breath. The baby settled against Valor's bare chest. His skin was hot from the ride, from the armor, from the furnace of adrenaline that had been burning in his blood for 3 days. The infant's body was cool against his, not cold, cool. The temperature of something that was losing its heat slowly, degree by degree, like a stone pulled from a fire and left in the open air. He wrapped his arms around her. His hands, which had held swords and treaties and the fate of nations, cupped the back of her head and the base of her spine, and she fit in the space between them the way a key fits a lock, as if his body had been built with this exact vacancy, this precise negative space that had been waiting, empty and unnamed, for the thing that would fill it. The baby's breathing was shallow. He could feel it against his chest, a faint, irregular flutter, like a bird trapped behind a window. Each breath was a negotiation, the lungs expanding a fraction of their capacity, the diaphragm working overtime, the whole system running on reserves that were depleting faster than they could be replenished. He pressed his mouth against the top of her head. Her skull was soft, terrifyingly soft. The bone not yet fused, the fontanelle pulsing with a heartbeat he could see, and the visibility of that heartbeat, the fact that he could watch the life moving through his daughter's body through a gap in her skull, was the most intimate and the most horrifying thing he had ever witnessed. Serafina watched him. Her eyes were dry, exhausted beyond the capacity for tears. She watched the king of Aurelian hold their daughter against his bare chest in a pump house while the empire he had built crumbled and reformed above them. And she watched something happen to his face that she had never seen before and had stopped believing was possible. He became afraid. Not the controlled strategic awareness of risk that he called fear when he spoke to soldiers. Not the calculated acknowledgement of danger that informed his tactical decisions. Actual fear. The kind that lives in the gut and makes the hand shake and turns the blood cold and reduces a man, any man, every man, to the fundamental animal reality that the thing he loves most is the thing he is most powerless to protect. "She is so small," he said. His voice was wrecked. A demolished structure. Load-bearing walls collapsed, roof caved in, nothing left but the foundation and the question of whether the foundation was strong enough to build on. "I did not know they could be this small." "She came early," Serafina said, "because of the stress, because of the running, because of everything." The words landed, each one a blow, each one precise, aimed not at his body, but at the structure of justification he had built around every decision that had led to this moment. Because of the stress meant because he had left her in a hostile court. Because of the running meant because she had been forced to flee through tunnels in the dark. Because of everything meant because of him. Because the empire he had chosen over his family had manufactured the exact conditions that were now killing his daughter. He did not argue. He did not defend. He sat on the floor of the pump house with his dying child against his chest, and he let the truth of what he had done settle over him like a weight he would carry for the rest of his life, however long or short that life might be. 40 minutes passed. The sun rose. The light came through the narrow window and turned the dust in the air to gold, and the gold was everywhere again, inescapable, the color of everything Valor had built and everything it had cost. Torvald returned. He brought a woman. She was not young, not old, somewhere in the territory between the two where experience had replaced beauty, but competence had replaced both. Her name was Marin, which was a coincidence that tasted like cruelty, and she carried a leather bag and the specific calm of a person who has seen too many emergencies to be impressed by any of them. She knelt beside Valor. She did not acknowledge his crown or his title or the fact that she was touching the king without permission. She placed her hand on the baby's chest. She held it there for 10 seconds. She tilted the baby's head back gently and looked at the nostrils, the chest movement, the color of the nail beds on fingers so small they looked like they belonged to a different species. "How many weeks?" she said. Serafina answered. 31, maybe 32. I lost count of the days. The woman, Marin, looked at Serafina with the particular kind of seeing that healers develop over decades. The ability to assess a patient's condition through the quality of their speech, the color of their skin, the thing behind their eyes that tells you whether they are fighting or surrendering. "You delivered in this room. No assistance?" Lirael helped. "My handmaiden." Her mother was a midwife. Marin nodded. She opened her bag. Inside were bottles, cloths, a small bellows-like device made of soft leather that Valor did not recognize and did not ask about, because asking would take time, and time was the thing he was losing. "The lungs are not mature," Marin said. "She is breathing, but she is working too hard for each breath. Her body is spending more energy on breathing than it has available. She needs warmth, which you are providing. She needs feeding, which we will arrange. And she needs stillness. No movement, no jostling, no transfer from person to person. She stays against skin, whose skin does not matter as long as the skin is warm and the heart beneath it is beating at a regular rhythm. The heartbeat gives her lungs a pattern to follow. Without that pattern, her breathing will become irregular, and irregular breathing in an infant this size leads to cessation. Cessation. The word hung in the air. A clinical term for a thing that Valor could not allow himself to name because naming it would make it a possibility, and he had spent his entire life converting possibilities into certainties, and this was the one possibility he would die to prevent from becoming certain. "What else?" he said. "Time," Marin said. "Time and warmth and feeding, and the kind of luck that cannot be manufactured. I will not lie to you. Her chances are poor. A baby this early, born under these conditions, without proper medical support in the critical first hours. She will either strengthen over the next 2 days, or she will not. The body decides. Not the physician, not the king, the body." Valor looked down at his daughter. Her face was pressed against his chest, her cheek flattened against his sternum, her ear directly over his heart. The heart that had driven him across battlefields and through siege lines and into the kind of violence that would give most men nightmares for the rest of their lives. That heart was now a metronome for his daughter's breathing, and the absurdity of it, that the organ which had powered his destruction was now being asked to power his daughter's survival, was a symmetry so cruel and so perfect that it felt designed. They moved to the queen's chambers. Slowly. Valor carried the baby against his chest, walking with the deliberate, measured steps of a man transporting an explosive device, each footfall calibrated to minimize vibration. Torvain had cleared the route. Soldiers lined the corridors, facing outward, their backs to the king, creating a tunnel of armed bodies that Valor walked through without seeing, because his entire visual field had narrowed to the 5-pound weight against his sternum and the faint, terrifying flutter of her breathing. The chambers had been cleaned. The fire was lit. The bed was made with fresh linens. Someone had placed flowers on the nightstand, white lilies, and someone else had removed them, probably Lirael, who understood that the aesthetics of comfort were an insult in a room where comfort had been absent for months. Valor sat on the bed. He did not remove his boots. He did not adjust his position. He sat with his back against the headboard and his daughter against his chest, and he did not move for 6 hours. Serafina slept beside him, not by choice but by collapse, her body finally executing the emergency shutdown it had been threatening since the pump house, the biological override that pulls consciousness away from a system that has been running on adrenaline for too long. She slept with her hand on Valor's arm, her fingers curled around his bicep, and even in sleep the grip was tight, the grip of a woman holding on to something she was not convinced would be there when she woke. Marin came and went. She checked the baby every hour. She showed Lirael how to drip goat's milk into the infant's mouth with a cloth wick, a slow, patient process that required the milk to be warmed and the wick to be positioned precisely, and the baby to be willing to swallow. And willingness was not always present because the swallowing reflex in a premature infant is inconsistent, a neurological coin flip that could go either way with each attempt. Valor watched every feeding. He watched the milk travel along the cloth wick. He watched the baby's throat move. He counted the swallows. He counted the breaths between swallows. He counted everything because counting was the only form of control available to him, and control was the only language he had ever been fluent in. And now that language was failing him because the thing he was trying to control was not a kingdom or an army or a political rival, but a biological process that did not respond to authority. Torvain came to the door twice. The first time to report that Marin Duskwood and 11 council members were in the cells and that the palace was fully secured. Valor nodded. The second time to report that the northern front had stabilized and that Commandant Raylan was holding the ridge. Valor nodded again. The nods were identical. Mechanically, the minimum acknowledgement required to dismiss a report, and Torvain understood that the king who had ridden 300 miles in 3 days to save his wife had been replaced by a father who was sitting in a room counting his daughter's breaths and could not be reached by anything that existed outside that room. Night came. The fire crackled. The baby breathed. Serafina woke, briefly, and found Valor exactly where she had left him, and the surprise in her eyes, the genuine, undisguised surprise that he was still there, was the most painful thing he had experienced in a life that was not short on pain. "You stayed," she said. "I am not leaving," he said. She looked at him. The firelight moved across his face, illuminating the scar, the stubble, the exhaustion carved into the skin beneath his eyes, like text engraved in stone. She looked at him and she did not see the king. She saw the man she had married, buried alive beneath 12 years of conquest and ambition and the compulsive accumulation of power, and she saw him struggling to the surface, clawing through the layers of everything he had built on top of himself, gasping, reaching, trying to remember how to exist without armor. She put her head on his shoulder, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, an acknowledgement that he was present, that his body was warm, that his heart was beating against their daughter's ear, and that those three things, presence and warmth and heartbeat, were enough for now. Enough to survive until morning. Enough to hold the world together for one more night. The second day was worse. The baby's breathing changed. Not dramatically, not the sudden crisis that Valor had been bracing for, but a subtle shift in rhythm, a lengthening of the pause between inhale and exhale that Marin noticed and Valor felt against his skin before anyone spoke. "She is tiring," Marin said. "Her body is spending energy it does not have. The feeding is not keeping pace with the expenditure." Serafina sat up. "What does that mean?" "It means the next 12 hours will determine the outcome. If her body can find a rhythm, if the feeding improves, if the warmth is sufficient, she may stabilize. If not..." Marin did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The unfinished sentence was louder than any completed one could have been. Valor looked at his daughter's face. Her eyes were closed. They had been closed for most of the past 24 hours, opening only briefly during feedings, and even then, the gaze was unfocused, distant, the eyes of a consciousness that had not yet decided whether to commit to the world it had been born into or retreat back to wherever it came from. He spoke to her, quietly. Not the voice of the king, not the voice of the general, the voice of a man who had nothing left to offer except words, and was discovering for the first time that words were the only thing that had ever mattered. "I know you are tired," he said. His mouth was close to her ear. His voice was a frequency that only she could hear, or that he wanted to believe only she could hear, because the words were not for anyone else, not for Serafina, not for Lyrael, not for the Empire. They were for the 5 pounds of struggling biology against his chest. "I know this is hard. I know the world is cold and loud and nothing like where you were, but I need you to stay. I am asking you to stay. I have never asked anyone for anything because asking is what people do when they are not strong enough to take. And I have always been strong enough to take. But I cannot take this. I cannot take you staying alive. I can only ask. And I am asking. Stay. Stay and I will be different. Stay and I will be the thing I should have been before you came. Stay and I will tear down every wall I ever built if it means you have room to breathe." The baby did not respond. Of course she did not respond. She was an infant less than 2 days old whose nervous system was still debating whether to continue functioning. But her breathing steadied, fractionally. A slight evening of the rhythm, the pause between inhale and exhale shortening by a margin so small it might have been imagination and might have been the difference between everything and nothing. Serafina heard him. She was sitting 3 feet away and she heard every word, and the words did something to the internal architecture that had been collapsing since the night of the reception. The night she had asked him to dance and he had released her and walked away. The words did not repair the damage. Nothing could repair the damage. But they laid the first stone of something new, something that did not yet have a name, something built not on the rubble of what had been destroyed but beside it, adjacent to it, acknowledging the ruins while refusing to inhabit them. She moved closer. She had pressed her body against his side. Her hand found the baby's back, and now the infant was sandwiched between them, held by 2 bodies, warmed by 2 hearts, enclosed in a space that was neither the king's nor the queen's, but something shared, something that required both of them to exist. And the baby's breathing steadied further, and Marin, watching from the foot of the bed, noted the change and said nothing because some observations are better served by silence. Hours passed. The fire burned. Lyrael brought food that Serafina ate and Valor did not. She brought water that both of them drank. She brought reports that Valor ignored and then, on the 3rd attempt, read with one eye while the other remained fixed on his daughter's chest, tracking the rise and fall, the rhythm that had become the center of his universe. The reports told him things. Marin Duskwood had broken under interrogation, not physically. Valor had not ordered physical interrogation because the order would have required him to leave the room, and leaving the room was not something he was willing to do. Marin had broken under the simpler pressure of reality, the reality that his plan had failed and his allies had been captured, and the king he had betrayed was sitting 3 floors above him, holding the child whose birth he had tried to prevent, and the weight of those facts had compressed Marin's composure until the truth leaked out like oil from a cracked vessel. The conspiracy was larger than Valor had imagined. The Northern Rebellion was funded by council gold. The bridge at Ashenmere had been destroyed by men paid from the palace treasury. The assassination of the garrison commander was ordered by Lord Theron Vask, the council's intelligence chief, a man who had sat across from Vaelor at 100 meetings and smiled with teeth that were, apparently, sharper than anyone had realized. The goal was not to kill Serafina. The goal was to isolate her, weaken her, ensure that the birth occurred under conditions controlled by the council, and use the child, alive or dead, as leverage to install a regency that would reduce the king to a figurehead. If the child lived, they would control its upbringing. If the child died, they would blame the queen's neglect and use the grief to justify removing her entirely. Either outcome served the same purpose. The transfer of real power from the throne to the council, accomplished not through the violence of revolution, but through the quiet machinery of institutional capture. Vaelor read this. He read it sitting in bed with his daughter against his chest and his wife asleep against his shoulder, and the fire casting shadows on the walls that looked like the shapes of the men who had betrayed him. And he felt something move through his body that was not anger. Anger was too small. Anger was what he felt when a battle went wrong or a treaty was broken or a rival underestimated him. This was different. This was the sensation of a man realizing that the system he had built, the empire he had chosen over his family, had been designed from its inception to consume the things he loved. He had not been betrayed by Meryn Duskwood. He had been betrayed by the architecture of his own creation. The walls he built to keep enemies out had become the walls that kept his family trapped inside, and the men he empowered to maintain those walls had used them as the scaffolding of their own ambition. The empire was a machine, and machines do not love, and he had fed his family into the machine because he was the only one who could not see that the machine had teeth. He set the report down. He looked at the ceiling. The stone was old, cracked, patched with mortar that was newer than the stone but old enough to have its own cracks, and the pattern of those cracks was the pattern of everything. Layers of repair built on layers of damage, each generation fixing what the last one broke and breaking new things in the process. Torvain came at midnight. The general stood in the doorway with the particular posture of a man who has news that cannot wait but wishes it could. The council members, Torvain said, they are requesting an audience. They claim they can offer information that will prevent further rebellion if granted clemency. Vaelor did not look away from the ceiling. How many of them knew about the bridge? All of them, my king. Duskwood's testimony implicates the entire inner council. And Thesara? The name came out flat, mechanical. The sound of a man pronouncing a word that used to carry weight and now carried only the residue of a mistake he could not unmake. Torvain shifted. Lady Morvain has been confined to her chambers. She claims she had no knowledge of the conspiracy. She claims her appointment as envoy was purely diplomatic. And you believe her? Torvain paused. I believe that belief is irrelevant, my king. What matters is evidence, and the evidence is being compiled. But I will say this. Meryn Duskwood named her. Not as a conspirator, but as a tool. He said she was placed near you deliberately to distract your attention from the court, to occupy the space that the queen should have occupied, so that the queen's isolation would appear natural rather than engineered. The words settled into the room like dust after a demolition. Vaelor absorbed them the way his body absorbed blows, with a tightening of the core and a redistribution of weight, and the immediate automatic assessment of how much structural damage had been sustained and whether the structure could continue standing. Thesara was a distraction. The thought was simple. The implications were not. He had been drawn to her, not because of desire, not because of any particular quality she possessed, but because she was easy. She was easy the way the empire was easy, a surface that reflected back the version of himself he wanted to see, powerful, desired, in control, without the complication of a woman who saw through the surface to the fractures beneath. Serafina saw the fractures. Serafina had always seen the fractures, and instead of admiring his armor, she had put her fingers in the gaps and asked what was underneath, and he had flinched away from her because the answer to what was underneath was a man who was afraid, and afraid was the one thing the king of Verelion could not afford to be. So he had turned to Thesara, who never asked what was underneath because she did not care, and the not caring had felt like relief, and the relief had felt like desire. And the desire had justified the distance, and the distance had nearly killed his wife and was currently killing his daughter. He closed his eyes. The baby breathed against his chest. In, out, each breath a tiny act of defiance against a world that had not prepared a place for her. Deny the audience, he said. No clemency, no negotiation. Every council member involved in the conspiracy will face trial, not a court trial. I will hear the evidence myself. I will look into their faces, and I will deliver judgment, every single one of them. Torvain nodded. And Marin Duskwood? Vailor opened his eyes. The ice was back, but it was different now. Not the controlled cold of a strategist calculating outcomes. The focused cold of something more primal, the temperature of a man who has located the thing responsible for threatening his child and is now operating on an imperative that predates law and politics and the concept of proportional response. Marin Duskwood tried to kill my daughter, Vailor said. Not with a blade, not with poison. He did it by inches. He did it by removing her physician and replacing her guard and sealing her correspondence and making her a prisoner in the one place she should have been safe. He did it slowly and deliberately, and with the patience of a man who understands that the most effective violence is the kind the victim does not recognize until it is too late. I want him to understand that I see what he did. I want him to understand that I see the patience and the deliberation and the slow, careful cruelty of it. And then I want him to understand that my response will not be patient. My response will not be deliberate. My response will be exactly as fast and as total as the fear he put into my wife when she was alone and pregnant and trapped in a palace full of his men. He will understand that. And then it will be over. Torvain left. The door closed. The fire popped. And Vailor Draven sat in the ruin of everything he had built and held the small, fragile thing that everything he had built had nearly destroyed. And he breathed with her, matching his rhythm to hers, slowing his heart to pace hers. Two bodies sharing the same rise and fall, the same transaction of oxygen, the same fundamental negotiation with a world that had not yet decided whether to let either of them survive. The third day arrived. Dawn came thin and cold through the chamber window, and Marin the healer sat beside the bed and placed her hand on the baby's chest and held it there for a long time, her face unreadable, her eyes processing information that her fingers were collecting through the skin. She is weaker, Marin said. Seraphina made a sound. Not a word. A sound from a place below language, the place where mothers store the responses to things that should not be happening. Her breathing has not stabilized. The feeding is insufficient. She is losing ground. I have seen infants recover from this point, but I will not lie to you and tell you that recovery is the most common outcome, because it is not. The most common outcome is that the body decides the cost of continuing is too high, and it stops. It does not ask permission. It does not give warning. It stops. Bafilor's arms tightened around his daughter. The tightening was involuntary, a reflex, the same reflex that made his hand go to his sword when he heard a sound in the dark. Except the threat was not in the dark. The threat was inside the 5-pound body he was holding. A threat he could not fight because it was not an enemy, but an absence, a deficit, a gap between what her body needed and what the world had given her. There must be something, he said. Something else. Some treatment, some medicine, some... Marin looked at him. She looked at him the way she probably looked at every father who asked this question, with the compassion of a woman who understood that the question was not really a question, but a refusal. The refusal to accept that the world contained problems that could not be solved by wanting them solved badly enough. There is one thing, she said. She paused. It is not medicine. It is not treatment. It is simply the truth that premature infants sometimes respond to sustained physical contact in ways that cannot be explained by biology alone. The heartbeat, the warmth, the pressure. Something about being held tells the body that it is not alone, and sometimes the body that believes it is not alone fights harder than the body that believes it is. I do not know why. I have seen it work, and I have seen it fail. But it is the one thing you can give her that I cannot provide from a bag. Vailor did not speak. He did not need to. He shifted his position, pressing the baby closer, adjusting her head so that her ear was directly over his heart, and he began to breathe deliberately, deeply, slowly, each inhale expanding his chest and pressing against her body, and each exhale settling her weight more firmly against him, and the rhythm became a communication, a message transmitted through skin and muscle and bone, a message that said, I am here. I am here. I am not leaving, not for the empire, not for the throne, not for any kingdom on this earth. I am here and I will stay here until you decide whether to live or die. And if you decide to die, I will be the last warm thing you know. Seraphina watched him. She watched the king of Varelion, the man who had conquered 11 kingdoms, hold a 5-pound baby against his bare chest and breathe for her, and the watching broke something open inside Seraphina that she had been keeping sealed, a reservoir of feeling that she had dammed up because feeling it would have incapacitated her. And incapacitation was a luxury she could not afford, while she was the only person standing between her child and the wolves. But the wolves were gone now. The door was guarded, the palace was secured, the conspiracy was in the cells, and the man who had left her alone was here, present, his armor on the floor and his crown on the nightstand, and his body serving as a furnace for their daughter. And the sight of him, reduced and raw, and doing the one thing she had always needed him to do, simply being there, was more than she could contain. She put her hand on his chest, beside the baby's head. She felt his heartbeat. She felt the baby's heartbeat. 2 rhythms, one strong and one faint, running in parallel. And between them, in the space where the rhythms overlapped, she felt the possibility of something she had stopped believing in. Hold her tighter, Seraphina said. He did. The day passed. The sun moved across the sky. The fire burned. Marin came and went. Lirael administered feedings. Torvon kept the world at bay. And in the center of it all, in a room that had once been a prison and was now something else, something that did not have a name yet, because the language for it had not been invented, a man held a baby and a woman held the man, and the 3 of them breathed together and waited for the body to decide. Evening came. The light changed. The room grew dim and then bright again as Lirael lit the candles, and the candlelight was warm and soft and kind in a way that the daylight had not been. And in that kindness, in that gentleness of diminished light, the baby opened her eyes. She opened her eyes and she looked at Valor. She looked at him with eyes that were dark and unfocused, and carried no recognition and no judgment and no understanding of who he was or what he had done or what he had failed to do. And in the absence of all of those things, in the pure, unburdened gaze of a creature that did not yet know what a king was, or what an empire was, or what any of it meant, Valor saw something that he had not seen in 12 years. He saw himself without the crown. He saw the man beneath the monument. He saw the terrified, ambitious, desperately lonely boy who had put on armor at 16 and had never taken it off, because taking it off meant feeling everything he had been using the armor to avoid. He saw himself the way Seraphina had always seen him, not the king but the person, and the person was flawed and frightened and capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary love and was, in this moment, holding the only thing in the world that had the power to make him choose between them. Her eyes are open, Seraphina said. I see them, Valor said. She's looking at you. I know. The baby's hand moved. Tiny fingers, each one no longer than the last joint of Valor's smallest finger, uncurled from the fist they had been clenched in since birth, and reached upward and found the edge of his jaw and rested there, 5 impossible points of contact against the roughness of his stubble, and the touch was so light that it should not have registered, and so heavy that it broke the last load-bearing wall in Valor Draven's internal architecture, and everything came down. He wept, not silently, not with the restrained dignity of a man performing grief. He wept with his mouth open and his face contorted and his body shaking against the headboard, holding his daughter against his chest, while the tears fell on her head and she did not flinch, because she did not know what tears were. She only knew that the body holding her was warm, and the heart behind it was beating, and the sound of weeping was just another frequency in the symphony of being alive. Seraphina held him. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders and pressed her forehead against his temple, and she held him the way you hold something that is falling apart, not to prevent the falling but to be present for it, to ensure that the pieces land somewhere they can be found. Marin stood in the doorway. She watched. She had seen this before, the moment when the body decides, and the moment was usually silent, and the silence was usually final. But this silence was different. This silence had a heartbeat in it, 2 heartbeats, 3. She stepped forward. She placed her hand on the baby's back. She held it there for a long time. Then she looked up at the king and the queen and the candlelit room and the armor on the floor and the crown on the nightstand and the two people who were holding each other and crying and breathing and existing in the wreckage of everything they had been, and she said the words that changed the shape of the rest of their lives. Her breathing has steadied. Her color is improving. She is not out of danger. She will not be out of danger for days. But she has turned a corner. Whatever you are doing, do not stop. Do not let go. Do not put her down. Valor looked at his daughter. His daughter looked at him. Her hand was still on his jaw. Her eyes were still open. And in those eyes, which had not yet learned to see but were practicing the motion, was the reflection of a man she did not know yet. A man who was holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. And she was. She was exactly that. And the man was exactly that to her, and the mutual dependency of it. The fact that they were each keeping the other alive through the simple act of contact was the most fundamental truth Valor had ever encountered. He did not stop. He did not let go. He did not put her down. Outside, the empire waited. The trials waited. The reckoning waited. The entire apparatus of power and consequence and the hard, ugly work of rebuilding what had been broken waited for the man who had broken it. But the man was busy. The man was holding his daughter. And the daughter was breathing, and the breathing was steady, and steady was enough. Steady was everything. And somewhere in the cells beneath the palace, Marin Duskwood sat in the dark and listened to the silence above him, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who is lost, that the king who would come for him would not be the king he had conspired against. The king who had ridden north to fight a war was a man who could be predicted, manipulated, outmaneuvered. The king who would descend those stairs would be something else entirely. Something that had been forged in a pump house and tempered in a 3-day vigil and hammered into shape by the tiny hand of an infant who did not yet know what a king was. And Marin Duskwood, for the first time in a life built on calculation, did not know what came next. Neither did Valor. But Valor was no longer afraid of not knowing, and that, more than any army, more than any crown, more than any empire carved from blood and iron, was the most dangerous thing in the world. 7 days after the birth, Valor Draven descended the stairs to the cells. He had not slept more than 40 minutes at a stretch since the pump house. His body had entered a state beyond exhaustion, a plateau where fatigue became ambient, woven into every muscle and every thought like a background frequency that the mind eventually stops registering. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands were steady. The steadiness was not strength. It was the specific calibration of a man who had been holding a 5-pound infant for a week and had trained every fiber in his arms to eliminate tremor, because tremor meant movement, and movement meant disruption, and disruption meant his daughter's breathing might falter, and if her breathing faltered, then nothing else in the world, not the empire, not the trials, not the reckoning waiting in the cells below, would matter. But Marin the healer had said the words that morning. She is stable. The corner has been turned. The body has decided to stay. The body has decided to stay. He had carried that sentence with him like a stone in his fist, feeling its weight, testing its reality, not quite trusting it because trust was a mechanism that had been damaged in him long before the conspiracy and had only gotten worse since. But Serafina had taken the baby from his arms, gently, with the careful choreography they had developed over 7 days of trading the child back and forth in a relay of warmth and heartbeat. And she had looked at him and said, "Go. Do what needs to be done. I have her." And he had gone. Down the corridors, past the guards who straightened as he passed, past the portrait gallery where the Draven kings watched from their frames with the same dead eyes they had always had, except now those eyes looked different to him. Not powerful, not regal, empty. The eyes of men who had confused legacy with living and had left behind paintings instead of people. The cells were beneath the east tower. Cold stone, low ceilings, torchlight that turned the air amber and thick. Marin Duskwood was in the last cell on the left, seated on a wooden bench, his sleeping robe replaced by prisoner's linen, his hair unwashed, his face carrying the specific deterioration of a man who has spent 7 days in the dark with nothing but his own decisions for company. He looked up when Valor entered. The cell door remained open. 2 guards stood in the corridor. Torvain waited at the threshold. Marin Duskwood studied the king. His eyes moved over Valor's face with the reflexive assessment of a political animal, cataloging changes, searching for leverage, scanning for the crack that might allow something to survive. He found nothing. The face looking back at him was not the face of the king he had conspired against. That king had been readable, predictable, a man whose ambitions followed traceable lines. This face was different. This face had been rearranged by something Marin did not understand because he had never experienced it, and the inability to read it was, for the first time in his career, genuinely frightening. "You look tired, my king," Marin said. His voice aimed for smoothness and landed somewhere in the vicinity of it, but did not arrive. Veilor pulled a wooden stool from the corner. He set it down 3 feet from the bench. He sat. His posture was not the posture of a king conducting an interrogation. It was the posture of a man who had come to look at something he needed to understand before he could decide what to do with it. "Tell me why," Veilor said. Marin blinked. The question was not what he had expected. He had expected accusation, raid, the theatrical prelude to a sentence he had already written in his mind. He had not expected why, because why was a question that assumed the answer mattered, and in his experience, the powerful did not care about reasons. The powerful cared about outcomes. "Why?" Marin repeated. "I have read Torvain's report. I know what you did. I know how you did it. I know who helped you, and how much you paid them, and which letters you intercepted, and which guards you reassigned. I know the mechanics of it. I do not know the reason. So tell me, why did you try to destroy my family?" Marin was quiet for a long moment. The torchlight moved across his face, and in the shifting light, he looked older than he was, aged by the cell and the cold and the specific gravity of being caught. "Because you made it easy," Marin said. Veilor's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. "You left," Marin continued. "You always left. You left your wife alone in a court that you built to reward ambition and punish weakness, and then you were surprised when the ambitious people in that court identified the weakest target and moved against her. You gave me the council. You gave me the treasury. You gave me access to every mechanism of power in this palace, and then you rode north to fight a war that I funded with your own gold. And you left your pregnant wife behind with nothing but a handmaiden and a title that means exactly as much as the force backing it, which was none, because the force was 300 miles away standing in mud." He leaned forward. His voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to the register of a man delivering a truth he had been carrying for years. "You want to know why, my king? Because you are a conqueror who forgot that the thing about conquering is that someone has to hold what you have taken, and you never held anything. You took and you moved on. You took kingdoms and you moved on to the next one. You took a wife and you moved on to a noblewoman who required less maintenance. You took a throne and you moved on to a war. And every time you moved on, you left a vacuum, and I am what fills vacuums. That is not a confession. That is an observation. You built an empire that rewards men like me, and then you are outraged when men like me do exactly what the empire incentivized us to do." The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. Dense with the weight of a truth that Veilor recognized not because it was new, but because he had been carrying it himself, in a different form, for 7 days. The knowledge that the conspiracy was not an aberration, but a product. That Marin Duskwood was not a flaw in the system, but the system's most successful output. That the empire had manufactured its own betrayal the way a body manufactures its own disease, from the inside, using its own materials, following its own logic to its own terminal conclusion. "You are right," Veilor said. Marin's expression shifted. A fracture in the mask. He had not expected agreement. "You are right that I built this. You are right that I left. You are right that the empire I created rewarded men like you and punished people like Serafina. Every word of that is accurate, and none of it changes what happens next." He stood. He looked down at Marin Duskwood, and the looking was not the looking of a king at a traitor, but the looking of a man at a mirror, a distorted mirror, a mirror that showed him the version of himself he would have become if he had been born with less power and more patience. "You will face trial," Veilor said. "Public trial. Every lord and lady in Varelion will hear what you did and why you did it. Not because I want them to see your punishment, because I want them to see my failure. I want them to understand that the king who left his wife unprotected is as responsible as the councilman who exploited that absence. And when the trial is over, you will be exiled, not executed. Execution would make you a martyr, and martyrs are more dangerous than traitors, because martyrs do not need to eat or sleep or make mistakes. You will be sent to the outer provinces with nothing, no title, no gold, no name. You will live the rest of your life as the thing you were most afraid of becoming. Ordinary. Marin's face went white, not with fear of death, but with the specific horror of a man who has just been shown a punishment precisely calibrated to the thing he values most. Death was an ending. Obscurity was a sentence. Valor walked to the door. He stopped. "One more thing," he said without turning. "My daughter is alive. She is breathing on her own. She weighs 5 pounds, and she has her mother's eyes. And she was born in a pump house because of what you did. I want you to carry that. I want it to be the first thing you think of every morning in whatever forgotten village you end up in. Not because I believe you are capable of guilt, but because I want the absence of guilt to be your punishment too. I want you to know that a normal man would feel something, and you do not. And that emptiness is the thing that made you useful and the thing that will make you alone for the rest of your life." He left. The cell door closed. The lock turned. And Marin Duskwood sat in the dark and felt, for the first time, the precise weight of the emptiness the king had described, and the weight was heavier than he had imagined because he had never bothered to lift it before. The trials took 3 weeks. Valor presided over each one personally, seated not on the throne, but on a wooden chair placed at floor level, the same height as the accused, the same height as the witnesses, the same height as every person in the room. The throne remained empty at the far end of the hall, visible, conspicuous in its vacancy, a reminder that the man who used to occupy it had chosen to come down from it. He spoke plainly. He presented evidence without embellishment. He allowed the accused to speak. And when they spoke, he listened, not with the performative attention of a ruler dispensing justice, but with the genuine focus of a man trying to understand the system he had created by examining its worst products. Lord Theron Vask, the intelligence chief who had ordered the garrison commander's assassination, stood before the court with the rigid posture of a man who believed his rank entitled him to a dignified proceeding. Valor gave him one, a thorough, meticulous, exhaustive proceeding in which every document was read, every witness heard, every decision traced back to its origin. The dignity was in the completeness. The punishment was in the exposure. By the time the trial ended, Theron Vask was not a powerful man who had made a controversial decision. He was a small man whose smallness had been made visible to every person in the kingdom, and the visibility was worse than any blade, because blades only cut the body, and visibility cuts the story a man tells himself about who he is. 11 council members were tried. 9 were exiled. 2, whose involvement was limited to passive knowledge rather than active participation, were stripped of title and land and released into the outer provinces with enough gold to survive but not enough to matter. The distribution of punishment was not generous or lenient. It was precise. Each sentence was calibrated to the specific nature of the betrayal, and the calibration itself was the message. The king who had returned from the pump house was a man who paid attention to detail, and the details he paid attention to had shifted from the strategic to the personal. The Sarah Morvain was not tried. She was summoned. She came to the queen's chambers on the 14th day. She came because Seraphina asked her to come, and the asking was not a request, but an instruction delivered through Lyriel with the quiet authority of a woman who had delivered a child in a pump house and survived a conspiracy, and was no longer interested in the decorative protocols of court life. Thesara entered. She was still beautiful. The copper hair, the careful posture, the face that belonged on currency. But the beauty had acquired a quality it did not possess before, a transparency, as if the events of the past 3 weeks had thinned the surface enough to see what was underneath, and what was underneath was not malice. It was compliance. The specific, practiced compliance of a woman who had learned that beauty was a commodity, and commodities are traded by the people who own them, not the people who are them. Seraphina was sitting by the window. The baby was in a cradle beside her, sleeping, wrapped in proper linen now, warm, breathing the steady rhythm that Marin the healer had pronounced satisfactory that morning. Valor was not in the room. Seraphina had asked him not to be. This conversation was not for him. "Sit," Seraphina said. Thesara sat. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were on the floor. The submission was total, and its totality was itself a kind of performance, and Seraphina saw through it the way she saw through everything now, because the pump house had burned away the last layer of willingness to accept surfaces as truth.
I'm not going to punish you, Serafina said. The Tsara looked up. The surprise was genuine, the first genuine expression Serafina had seen on her face.
I am not going to punish you because punishment implies that you had power, and you did not. You were placed near my husband by men who understood that a beautiful woman in proximity to an ambitious man is not a relationship but a weapon, and weapons do not choose their targets. You were aimed. Marin Duskwood aimed you. And my husband, who should have been smarter than to mistake a weapon for a companion, was not smarter, because intelligence and wisdom are different instruments, and he has always had more of the former than the latter. She paused. The baby stirred in the cradle. A small sound, a murmur, the unconscious commentary of an infant processing a world that was still mostly texture and temperature and the occasional intrusion of light. But I need you to leave, Serafina said. Not the kingdom, not even the city, just the palace. I need you to go somewhere that is not here, because every time I look at you, I see the months I spent alone in this room while my husband spent his evenings in your company, and I am trying to forgive him for that, and your presence makes the forgiveness harder. That is not your fault. That is the architecture of a situation none of us chose. But the architecture is what it is, and I am the one who has to live in it. And I am asking you, as one woman to another, to give me the space to rebuild it without a reminder of what knocked it down. The Tsara was quiet. Something moved behind her eyes. Something that the compliance and the beauty and the years of being traded between powerful men had not quite managed to kill. Something that looked, from a certain angle, like relief. I did not hate you, the Tsara said. Her voice was different, smaller, stripped of the modulation that court life required. I know you think I did. I know the court assumed I was your rival, but I was never your rival, my queen, because a rival is someone who wants what you have, and I never wanted what you have. I never wanted to love him. Loving a man like Valor Draven is a punishment I would not wish on anyone, and you have endured it with a courage that I do not possess, and have never pretended to. She stood. She smoothed her gown with hands that were steadier than her voice. I will leave by morning, she said. And for whatever it is worth, which may be nothing, I am glad your daughter lived. I am glad she lived, and I am glad he was there when it mattered, and I am glad that something in this palace, finally, turned out the way it was supposed to. She left. The door closed. Serafina sat by the window and listened to the baby breathe, and felt the space in the room expand by exactly one person, and the expansion was not dramatic or cathartic, but it was necessary, the way removing a splinter is necessary, small and precise, and followed by the particular relief of an irritation that has become so constant you forgot it was there until it was gone. Valor found her there an hour later. He stood in the doorway the way he had taken to standing in doorways lately, not entering automatically but pausing, waiting, as if the room required an invitation that had not always been extended and that he was no longer arrogant enough to assume. She looked at him. Come in, Valor. He entered. He sat beside her. The window overlooked the valley where his army had departed 3 weeks ago, and where, now, farmers were plowing fields that had been trampled by cavalry horses, turning the scarred earth over, burying the hoofprints under fresh soil. The metaphor was obvious enough that neither of them mentioned it. The Tsara is gone, Serafina said. I know. Are you going to ask me what I said to her? No. She looked at him. He was watching the valley. His profile was the same profile she had fallen in love with at her father's estate. The same jaw, the same scar, the same set of the shoulders that made him look like he was carrying something invisible and heavy. But the weight had shifted. It had not disappeared. It would never disappear. But it had redistributed itself from the external to the internal, from the weight of an empire on his shoulders to the weight of knowledge in his chest. And the knowledge was this, that he had almost lost everything. And the almost was not a near miss, but a direct hit that had simply failed to kill. And the failure was not his doing, but the doing of a handmaiden and a farrier and a healer and a woman who had swung a candlestick in the dark. And if those people had not existed, if the world had been even slightly less generous with its accidental heroes, then the baby sleeping in the cradle would not be sleeping, and the woman sitting beside him would not be sitting, and the man he was becoming would have died in the pump house along with everything he had failed to protect. I am going to change the council, he said. Not replace it. Change it. The structure. The way power flows through it. The way it can accumulate in the hands of a few men while the rest of the kingdom starves for representation. I'm going to break it apart and rebuild it with checks that I should have built in from the beginning, oversight that does not depend on my presence, because I cannot always be present, and the system has to function when I am not. Serafina listened. She did not respond immediately. She had learned over 3 years, and particularly over the last 3 weeks, that the space between a man's intention and his execution was where most promises went to die, and she was no longer willing to celebrate intentions. "That is a start," she said. He looked at her. The looking was direct, unguarded, the look of a man who has removed his armor and is standing in the cold and is not pretending the cold does not exist. "I know it is only a start," he said. "I know that structural reform does not fix what I did to you. I know that changing the council does not change the fact that I told you the empire comes first. I know that the man who said those words is the same man sitting here now, and that trust, once broken, does not repair on schedule. I am not asking you to trust me. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to let me be here, in this room, beside you, doing the work, for as long as it takes, even if it takes the rest of my life. Even if the rest of my life is not enough." The baby made a sound. Both of them turned. The small face in the cradle scrunched, relaxed, scrunched again, and then settled into the expression of profound disinterest that infants adopt when the world has failed to offer them anything worth waking for. Serafina reached into the cradle and adjusted the blanket. Her hand lingered on the baby's chest, feeling the heartbeat, the respiration, the warmth, the ongoing miracle of a body that had decided to stay. "She does not have a name yet," Serafina said. "I know. I was waiting for you to be here." The sentence landed. 5 words that contained 3 weeks of loneliness and 7 months of isolation and 3 years of a marriage that had been starving while the empire feasted, and underneath all of that, the stubborn, inexplicable, completely irrational decision to wait. She had waited for him, despite everything. Despite the abandonment, and the noblewoman and the empire comes first, and the cold beds and the sealed letters, and the wolves inside the walls. She had waited because some part of her, some deep and unreasonable and fundamentally human part, had refused to give up on the possibility that the man she married was still alive somewhere inside the king she had lost him to. Vialor looked at his daughter. He looked at her for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was the voice she remembered from their wedding night. The voice that had said things he had later broken and was now, slowly, clumsily, with the awkwardness of a man relearning a language he had forgotten, trying to say again. "Alara," he said. "Her name is Alara." Serafina tested the word. "Alara." It sat in her mouth like a small, warm stone. "Alara. What does it mean?" "It does not mean anything," he said. "It is just a sound. But it is a sound that has no history. No political weight, no dynastic obligation. It is just a name, her name, not a legacy, not a title, just who she is." Serafina looked at him, and in the looking, something shifted. Not the dramatic shift of forgiveness or reconciliation. Something smaller, something more honest. A willingness to believe that the next step might be different from the last one. Not a guarantee, not a promise, just a willingness. And willingness, in a marriage that had been through what theirs had been through, was not a small thing. It was the entire thing. It was the foundation on which everything else would either be built or not built. And the building would take years, and some of it would fail, and some of it would hold. And the only way to find out which was to start. "Alara," she said again. And this time she was not testing the word. She was accepting it, placing it on the small sleeping face in the cradle like a first gift. A gift that cost nothing and meant everything because it was given by both of them together, the first thing they had agreed on in months. And the agreement was not about politics or power or the distribution of resources across a continent. It was about a name, a 6-letter word for a 6-pound girl who had been born in a pump house and had almost died in a candlelit room and was now sleeping in a cradle by a window that overlooked a valley where the earth was being turned and the hoof prints were being buried, and the world was beginning tentatively to grow again. Months passed. The council was restructured. Valor dissolved the inner circle and replaced it with a body of 12 representatives drawn from the provinces, the guilds, and the military, each serving a limited term, each subject to review, each operating under a charter that distributed authority laterally rather than vertically. The charter was not perfect. It was a first attempt by a man who had spent 12 years consolidating power and was now, with the uncomfortable clumsiness of a predator, learning to eat with its hands instead of its teeth, trying to distribute it. There were arguments, there were compromises. There were moments when Valor's instinct to command collided with the Charter's requirement to consult, and the collision produced friction, and the friction produced heat, and the heat was uncomfortable. And the discomfort was necessary because comfort was the soil in which corruption grew, and he had grown enough corruption to last a lifetime. He stopped riding to the front of the column. He stopped leading charges. He stopped being the first man through the gate and the last man off the field because those gestures, which had once felt like courage, now felt like what they actually were. The habits of a man who was more comfortable facing death than facing the people who depended on him to live. He came home. Every evening. He walked into the Queen's chambers, which were now their chambers, and he picked up Alara and held her, and the holding was not a performance or a duty, but a need, the specific physical need of a man who had discovered that the only thing more terrifying than losing control was loving something that could be lost and choosing to love it anyway. Serafina watched him change the way you watch a season change, not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of small shifts that gradually alter the landscape. He was not a different man. She did not want a different man. She wanted the man she had married to stop hiding inside the king, and slowly, painfully, with setbacks and regressions and the occasional relapse into the cold authority that had been his default setting for a decade. That was what was happening. She did not forgive him all at once. Forgiveness, she discovered, was not a moment but a practice. A daily decision to set down the weight of what had happened and pick up instead the possibility of what might happen next. Some days the weight was light, and the possibility was bright, and the practice was easy. Some days the weight was crushing, and the possibility was dim, and the practice was the hardest thing she had ever done. Harder than the pump house, harder than the tunnels, harder than the night someone tried her door. Because the pump house and the tunnels and the night at the door were events that happened to her, and forgiveness was something she had to do, actively, with her whole self, every single day. And the effort was exhausting, and the reward was uncertain, and the only reason she continued was that the alternative was worse. The alternative was staying in the room where the marriage died. And she had spent enough time in that room. A year passed. Alara grew. She grew the way premature babies grow, in fits and starts, lagging behind the milestones and then suddenly leaping ahead, her body catching up to itself in bursts of development that left her irritable and hungry and delighted in unpredictable rotation. She crawled at 10 months. She walked at 14. She said her first word at 11 months, and the word was not mama or papa, but no, delivered with the fierce conviction of a person who had entered the world under protest and had not yet fully consented to its terms. Valor was present for all of it. Not every moment. An empire does not run itself, even a restructured one, and there were days when the work took him away for hours and nights, when the dispatches kept him at his desk until the candles burned to stubs. But he came back. Every time. He came back and he picked up his daughter and he held her. And she grabbed his face with both hands and looked at him with the complete, terrifying directness of a child who does not yet know how to pretend. And in that directness, he found something he had not found in 12 years of conquest. He found the absence of performance. Alara did not care about the crown. She did not care about the empire. She did not care about the scar on his temple, or the weight of his reputation, or the number of kingdoms that answered to his name. She cared about warmth and food and the sound of his voice and the feeling of being held. And these were the only currencies she accepted, and they were the only currencies that had ever been worth anything. And the fact that it had taken him 37 years and a near catastrophe to learn this was a humiliation he carried with a gratitude he had not known he was capable of. On the anniversary of Alara's birth, Violor went to the pump house. He went alone. The building had not been repurposed. It stood at the edge of the eastern courtyard, small and gray and unremarkable, the kind of structure you walked past 1,000 times without seeing. He opened the door. The bench was still there. The stove was still there. The stone floor where his knees had hit when he knelt in front of Serafina was still there, and the indentation his armor had made was still visible. If you knew where to look, 2 shallow depressions in the packed earth, the fossil record of the moment a king stopped being a king and started being a father. He stood in the room for a long time. He did not kneel. He did not weep. He stood and he looked at the bench and the stove and the narrow window and the space where his daughter had been born, and he felt the full weight of everything that had happened in this room, and everything that had almost happened, and the weight did not crush him. It settled. It found a place inside him, a permanent residence, and it would live there for the rest of his life, not as a burden, but as ballast, the thing that kept him from drifting back to the man he used to be. He left the pump house. He walked across the courtyard. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the flagstones, and his shadow walked ahead of him, stretched and distorted by the angle of the light, the shadow of a man who was taller than he actually was, and he looked at the shadow and thought, "That is who I used to be." The elongated version, the distorted version, the version that was larger than life because life at actual size was too frightening. He walked into the palace. He climbed the stairs. He opened the door to their chambers and found Serafina sitting on the floor with Alara, who was surrounded by wooden blocks she had arranged in a pattern that made sense only to her, a pattern that involved stacking 3 blocks vertically and then knocking them down with her fist, and then laughing with the full-body delight of a person who has discovered the fundamental pleasure of building something and destroying it and building it again. Serafina looked up. She saw his face. She knew where he had been. "Are you all right?" she said. He sat down on the floor beside them. His knees cracked. His back protested. He was 37 years old and he felt 60. The cumulative debt of a decade of sleeping in armor and riding through storms and carrying the weight of a continent on a spine that had never been designed for the load. "I am all right," he said. Alara looked at him. She held out a block. A red one, chipped on one corner, worn smooth on the edges from repeated handling. She held it out with the imperious generosity of a 1-year-old who has decided to share and expects the sharing to be received with appropriate gravity. He took the block. He placed it on top of her stack. She knocked it down. She laughed. He rebuilt the stack. She knocked it down again. The cycle repeated 5 times, 6 times, 7, the oldest game in the world, the game of building and breaking and building again. And each iteration was exactly the same and completely new. And the newness was the point, the recognition that repetition is not stagnation but practice, and practice is how the broken thing learns to be whole. Serafina leaned against his shoulder. Her weight settled against him, familiar and warm and carrying the particular quality of a body that has decided to stay. Not the body of the baby this time, the body of the woman, the body that had been through the tunnels and the pump house and the loneliness and the recovery and had arrived, not at forgiveness, not at the finish line, but at the place where the road continues and the walking is no longer done alone. He put his arm around her. She did not stiffen. She did not pull away. She leaned in, fractionally, the smallest possible increase in contact, and the smallness of it was the honesty of it. The admission that trust rebuilds in increments so tiny they are almost invisible. And the almost invisible is where all the real work happens. Alara knocked down the blocks. She looked at the scattered pieces on the floor. She looked at her father. She looked at her mother. And then she began to rebuild the stack, 1 block at a time, with the focused determination of a person who does not yet know that some things cannot be fixed, and therefore fixes everything. The sun went down. The room grew dim. The fire was lit. The candles were placed, and in the warm, quiet, imperfect space of a room that had once been a prison and was now, slowly becoming a home, the king of Verelion sat on the floor with wooden blocks and a daughter who had taught him more in 1 year than the empire had taught him in 12. And he learned the lesson that every conqueror eventually learns or dies without learning. The lesson was not that power is bad. Power is a tool, and tools are neutral. And the neutrality of tools is what makes them dangerous in the hands of people who confuse the tool with the purpose. The lesson was not that love conquers all. Love does not conquer anything. Love is not a weapon. Love is the thing that remains when the weapons are put down, and its value is not in its strength but in its persistence, its stubborn refusal to disappear even when it has been neglected and starved and left alone in a palace full of wolves. The lesson was simpler, smaller, the size of a wooden block in a 1-year-old's fist. The lesson was that the man who holds the sword decides what the sword is for, and the man who puts the sword down decides what he is for. And the second decision is harder. And the second decision is the only one that matters. And the second decision is never made once. It is made every morning, every evening, every time the blocks are knocked down and the choice arises to rebuild or walk away. Valor Draven chose to rebuild. Not because he was brave, not because he was wise, not because he had learned some grand cinematic truth about the nature of power and the fragility of love, because his daughter handed him a block, and he took it, and he placed it on the stack, and she knocked it down, and he did it again, and again, and again. And the stack never stayed standing, and he never stopped building, and that was enough. That was everything.